Well, welcome back to the Comic Book Historians Podcast. I'm Alex Grant with my co-host Jim Thompson. Today we have a really fun guest, publisher, comic book historian, childhood comic fan extraordinaire, Gary Groth. Gary, thanks for being with us today.
Happy to be here.
So I know you were born in 1954, a son of a Navy contractor. You were actually born in Buenos Aires?
I was born in Buenos Aires. My dad was in the Navy. And I was born there because he was on active duty and he was stationed in Buenos Aires. Yeah.
And then was he still in the Navy when you moved to Springfield?
Yeah, he was. He was in the Navy for about 30 years. Let me see. Let me walk that back. He joined the Navy, I think, in 39. And so that means he would have retired from the Navy in 69. So I think that's approximately right. And we moved to, from Buenos Aires, we moved to Williamsburg, Virginia. And I was about 2.
How long were you in Williamsburg?
I'm sorry?
How long were you in Williamsburg?
Until I was 5. So I think we were there about 3 years. And then we moved to Springfield, Virginia, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C.
I spent my first 25 years in Richmond, Virginia. So
it's like down the road.
Yep, I know. But very different still. You guys were less Confederate than we were back in Richmond.
Well, the whole Washington, D.C. area is sort of an oasis in Virginia. I mean, you drive 20 minutes south and you're in the Confederacy.
Yep.
Which I've done.
But yeah. Jim is in no way affiliated with that now.
I'm an expatriate pretty much, but I did grow up there.
Right. Where do you live now?
Los Angeles.
Okay. Yeah.
I moved out here in 1985. I've lived here longer than I ever lived in Richmond.
Yeah. Same here in Seattle. I've lived here longer than any place I've ever lived, including my upbringing in Virginia.
So you were pretty close to your father then, it sounds like, because he was part of your kind of pop culture upbringing, wasn't he, in some way?
Well, yes. I mean, he was. He was of his generation, World War II generation. He died 5 years ago at the age of 99. So he had me when he was 39, I think. So he was a little older. And, and I was kind of an oddball kid. And I don't think he quite understood because, he grew up in Queens. He was born in Queens. And his ambition was to be shortstop for the New York, I don't know if I'm going to get it right, like the New York Dodgers, I don't know. It was like a New York baseball team. And that was his ambition in life, which he didn't fulfill, which is why he joined the Navy when he was 19 or 20. And I had no interest in sports. I couldn't do sports, was terrible at them. It was the worst thing I experienced in high school. And so I retreated into comics, and he never read comic books. He read comic strips. So he didn't quite understand what I was doing, but he understood the passion. And I think he understood that, if we were going to be close and if he was going to be part of my life, he was going to be part of that. And he was very supportive. I mean, both my parents were very supportive. But he helped a lot doing the nuts and bolts work when I put out a fanzine when I was 13 years old. He did all the bookkeeping, which he was very good at. He was very meticulous, which I am not. Very detail oriented, and he kept the ledgers and he kept the books. I put out a fanzine. I'm sure you're going to get there. I put out a fanzine when I was 13. And it started off as a kind of typical, terrible fan worshipping little fanzine. We called them crudzines back then. And he kept all the books. He, we would get orders in, and I think it cost 50 cents. And so people would send quarters in, taped to cardboard. And we would open those envelopes and we would take the quarters out, and he would very meticulously put them in a ledger, put the name of the person, and we would have to mail the person the fanzine, and he would probably handle a lot of that. When I printed the fanzine, we would go to his office, and they had a Xerox machine there, and that's when Xerox machines were much more rare. People didn't own Xerox machines. Companies and governments owned Xerox machines. So we would go to his office and Xerox my fanzine, and we would come home and we would staple it together. We would staple the fanzines together. And so he was very much, very, very supportive and very, very much a part of what I did back then. He also, another big component of our lives was that he basically introduced me to movies. Every Saturday or Sunday, after he got home from playing golf, we would go see a movie. We'd get in the car and go see a movie. And back then in the 60s, they didn't really make movies for kids. There were a few, but, primarily they did not cater to children. And so what I saw were the same movies that he saw, and they were like war movies, they were detective movies, mysteries. I mean, they starred John Wayne and Kirk Douglas and Burt Lancaster, that whole generation of actors.
Yeah.
And that's probably where I discovered my great love of film, by going to see a movie every weekend.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I want to talk about that a little bit. And I had the same experience because you didn't have the other distractions. And so Dad would take me to see High Plains Drifter or something, when I'm like completely inappropriate to go see it.
I saw that with my dad. I'm a little older than you are because I was more or less a grown up. I was probably about 21 or 22 when I saw that. And I actually took my dad to see that movie.
Yeah. Yeah, that's I remember that one as one.
And that would be pretty inappropriate for a kid. Brutal.
So I want to we're talking about the fanzine era, but I want to go back in time a little bit and talk about Men No.5.
Yeah.
Tell us what the significance of that.
Well, I discovered that comic in my pediatrician's office.
Yep.
I wouldn't say I was a sickly child, but I had asthma, and I also had allergies, both of which I still have. And so I would go to the pediatrician's office and get allergy shots every week or two. And I think I discovered that comic sitting in his office. They had a pile of comics sitting there. And it is the first comic I distinctly remember seeing. And I forget I don't know, you probably know what year that comic was.
Oh yeah, I did my
64. 64, okay.
It was a January, a December, January release. And so you would have been 9.
Right.
I did the checking.
Right. So. Now, I might have read, I don't know, I might have read some comics before that. I have vague memories of reading comics like Hot Stuff and Richie Rich and, that whole line of kids comics. And I can't remember where that fell, if it fell before that or after that. But it was that Metal Men comic that was a revelation to me.
Yeah, I read that from there. You just went. You just were all in from.
I just went apeshit. Yeah, I just started buying comics, and of course, I started buying DC comics.
Now, did the Gorilla covers help you go more apeshit over the comics you're reading?
They did not. I was not aware of the Gorilla trend, although it was apparently happening. When I was in prime comics buying mode. but no, but that was part of that whole goofy DC period, which I probably enjoyed.
Right.
I think it was anyway.
And you were kind of DC focused for that first year, but by
For a while.
65, 66, you moved to Marvel pretty much, right?
Yeah, it probably took a couple of years. I'll tell you one funny story. It's possible the first Marvel comic I bought was Strange Tales, which, as I'm sure you know, they split the comic between the Human Torch and another character. Was it the Thing?
It was Doctor Strange.
Doctor Strange and the Human Torch. And I think I actually bought that comic because I had mistaken the Human Torch for the Flash.
Yeah.
I mean, they're both red, so they seem like the same character. So I remember buying it, taking it home, and reading it, and realizing this was a different reading experience. It was just all the rhythms of the Marvel comics were entirely different. The drawing was different. DC's drawing was much more domesticated. There was something cruder about Marvel.
Right. And DC, weren't they kind of subsumed in that smooth New York Dan Barry type aesthetic? That
a lot of Kurt Swan,
yeah.
Wayne Boring. Yeah. They were much slicker than Marvel.
Yeah.
And so I noticed that intuitively. I mean, I was probably 12 or something. But then I realized that there was this whole other comics brand out there, and I started picking up on those. And the first Fantastic Four I bought was number 33. And again, I don't know what year that was, but it was probably around 65 or something like that.
And you started doing mail order, catching up on the earlier issues, right?
Yeah, I had to have all the early issues that I'd missed, which I eventually got. So I would order them by mail. They had a lot of dealers back then, and you would order them by mail. One of the great moments of my life is when my folks drove me to Passaic, New Jersey. There was a place called the Passaic Book Company, and I would order comics from them. And that's when, you could order a back issue of Spider-Man for like $1 or $2, something like that. So it wasn't outrageous. And I would order a couple of comics, and then I would be utterly thrilled. I'd be waiting for like a week for the comic to arrive in the mail. And of course, when it got there and just opening that package was so exciting. And so somehow I talked my parents into driving to Passaic, New Jersey. It was, a little family outing, and it probably, it was probably a round trip in one day. And they, and they were a big back issue comics dealer. Mm-hmm. And they might have been a book dealer, just a general book dealer as well. But they had this one gigantic room with nothing but comics in it. And it just blew my mind. I mean, I was like 14 or, 15 at the time. And I remember going in there. I mean, it was just pig heaven. I didn't have enough money to buy all the comics I needed to buy. But that was great. But yeah, I did. I collected, I would buy back issues, mostly of Marvel. I don't remember buying back issues of DC. I think I was more addicted to Marvel, and I was more obsessed with Marvel.
Now, were you only reading superhero stuff at this point? Like not their Westerns or their romance or...
No, I was reading every single Marvel comic. I was reading all their Westerns. I even bought Millie the Model, which I had obviously no interest in. But I would read it.
Patsy and Hetty, something like that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, just because it was a Marvel comic, and I wanted to keep abreast of all the Marvel comics. Yeah. I mean, I joined the Marvel Merry Marching Society.
Oh, yeah? You're one of those guys. That's awesome.
Yeah. Got no prizes. I had outgrown it by the time Foom came around, so I did not join that. But yeah, there was a period of 3 or 4 years, when I happily drank the Kool-Aid.
Now you had mentioned your dad read comic strips. Were you interested in those as well?
Marginally. I would read comic strips, but I like the longer form narrative of comics. Even the DC comics, which were I think almost all self-contained stories, as opposed to the Marvel serialized soap opera. So I think I like the longer stories. I mean, I could read the Sunday newspaper strips, and I kind of dug them, but if you read a 22-page Stanley Jack Kirby story, it's got so much more satisfaction to it than reading than reading a third of a page or a half page story in the newspaper. So I never really picked up that habit. I learned everything I knew about newspapers a little bit later.
Now, did you quit Marvel before Kirby and Ditko left, or
No.
Was it around their departure that helped end it?
Well, Ditko left around 69, 68.
No, Ditko left
a little
Marvel in
earlier.
like 66.
Did he leave that early?
Yeah,
Okay.
then Kirby left in 70. Wally Wood
Yeah,
left.
Kirby left later. Kirby left in 70. Yeah, no, I didn't. I kept reading Marvels. Let me see. Well, no, I mean, I kept reading Marvels through high school, and I graduated in 72. So I probably kept reading through about 72. I mean, I have to tell you, I got less interested in the comics themselves when I was putting out this fanzine than I was in the artists and in producing the fanzine. I know that sounds paradoxical, but I think I became less fanatically interested in reading the comics in the last year or two of my high school than I was about being involved in this fandom and following the very specific artists that I was and starting to know the artists I met, because I started meeting artists when I was, 14 or 15.
Yeah. How'd that all start? I mean, let us about Fantastic.
Well, I'm going to get to that, Alex, in a minute. I just want to do one or two things and then get to the fanzine. Every single review every piece on you that I read that was sort of generic would say influences Pauline Kael and Andrew Sarris.
Yeah.
And my question is, don't you have to pick a side? How do you do both Pauline Kael and Sarris? And if that's true, do you lean towards Sarris, and are you an auteur theory person?
Okay. Well, now this is later. This is like in my 20s.
Right.
And yes, I did pick a side. Now the side for me was not between Sarris and Kael. It was between John Simon and Stanley Kaufman and Pauline Kael and Andrew Sarris. Now, so we're talking about film criticism in the 1970s. This gets very complicated. Sarris and Kael clashed. I mean, but almost all of the critics who worked in the 1970s, started in the 1960s, they worked in the 1970s, they were all clashing with each other. But there were camps. And I was in the John Simon, Stanley Kaufman camp, which was, I think, the more literary side of film criticism. Whereas Pauline Kael, Andrew Sarris, who else? Well, do you know a critic named Vernon Young?
Yes.
Okay. Well, he would have been, he again would have been in the Simon Kaufman. Manny Farber, I thought, straddled, the middle. He was somewhere in the middle.
Boy, he could write, though. I'm a big fan of Manny Farber.
He was terrific. I mean, they were all good. I mean, I think, but I do think the best writers, quad writers were Simon and Kael. I'm sorry, Simon and Kaufman. I mean, Kael could write, but and I love to engage Kael. But there was something about Kael that bothered me. She would tend to write more around movies than about them. Whereas I thought Simon just nailed it. I mean, he would just, he was so precise in his criticism, and agreeing or disagreeing with the critic was not ever the point. Because I could profitably disagree with all of these guys.
So I deliberately skipped to that because it seemed to me that as much as comics and the influence of comics, as we were talking about, the influence of these particular people helped you formulate your ambitions and your style as it relates to comiks. So I thought it was important.
Yeah, well, it's absolutely true. The first film critic I encountered was Dwight McDonald, who wrote for Esquire magazine.
Oh, that was when you were in college. That first, your professor had you read all of Esquire.
Yes. So you've done some research here. Yeah, I had it was a community college. It was after my first year of college, and I was flailing around. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. And so when you don't know what you want to do with your life, you take a creative writing class. And I think that's what this was. It was actually a creative writing class. And, really, I didn't know anything about writing. I mean, all the writers I'd read were just second-rate pulp writers. I'd read, Robert E. Howard. I mean, I couldn't distinguish good writing from bad writing. So I took this course, and this guy, whose name I no longer remember, he really opened my eyes to what good writing was. And one of the things he told us to do was to read Esquire. And I think at that time, that would have been like 1973. At that time, Esquire was running a lot of great writers. They had Dwight McDonald writing film criticism. I think Nora Ephron had a column. I forget who wrote the literary column. It might have been James Woolscott, might have been. And it was a writer's magazine at that time. And it really suddenly opened my eyes to what good writing was. And so I would read Dwight McDonald, and then I would go out and buy his book of film criticism. And then John Simon took over from Dwight McDonald, and that's how I started reading John Simon. And then I would buy his book of film criticism. The first book of his I read was Movies into Film. And that was eye-opening, because here was somebody who clearly had an enormous amount of expertise, who was an extraordinarily good writer, and who was applying these honed critical skills to film, something that I hadn't truly considered before. And of course, that's what led me to thinking, well, why isn't someone applying these same skills to comics? And that had been done erratically in the past, and very, very, very rarely, and we can talk about that. But that's what opened my eyes. And then, of course, John Simon, he had a big essay in Movies into Film about Pauline Kael.
Oh yeah.
Where he attacked her essay, which was called Movies and Trash, and whatever it was called. And then I thought, of course, well, who's Pauline Kael? And I had to go out and buy her books. So I would take notes about who all of these, Dwight McDonald and John Simon and then Pauline Kael, and I would take notes about who they're writing about. And if John Simon mentioned Susan Sontag, I would have to go out and find out who she was.
Yep, it's just one leads to another.
Yeah.
Let's go back to when you're 14, before you know any of this, but you're starting your publishing career to some degree at that point. Yeah. And I read that by the time you were 17, you were telling your parents you wanted to be a publisher.
Well, that's true. I think I wanted to be a publisher, because the first college I went to was the Rochester Institute of Technology. And the only reason I went to that is because, my parents had not gone to college. And so they really didn't know how to navigate finding a college. And so we were looking for a college that taught publishing. Well, there was no such college. I don't think there were university courses about publishing. And so the Rochester Institute of Technology was the closest thing we could find to publishing, because they specialized in teaching printing technology. Now, in fact, of course, printing technology has nothing to do with actually publishing. But neither I nor my parents knew that at the time. So that's why I went there. I went because I wanted to be a publisher. After a year there, I realized that was not really training me to be a publisher, and that there was no training you could have that would make you a publisher except being in publishing. And I think that might be, in retrospect, why I started kind of floundering around, because I didn't know how to be a publisher. I knew how to publish a fanzine and make no money, out of my parents' bedroom, but I didn't know how to become a publisher.
And I have some questions about the Rochester Institute and also your journalism aspect where you're working on a magazine. But before I do that, I still want to do Fantastic Fanzine, because that's obviously important, that you started in 2014, and you had people like Tony Isabella and Mark Evanier and artists like Dave Cockrum before when he was still before he went professional. You were getting art from Neil Adams to Bill Everett. How was this happening when you were age 14? And talk a little bit about that aspect.
Well, I didn't have any hesitancy in writing to artists, and I would write to them. I would initially write to them in care of Marble in DC, and apparently they would. The companies would forward the letters, because I seem to remember I ran an interview with John Romita, I think in like 1968 or something like that.
Yeah.
And that was done entirely by the mail. I sent him, I sent him a letter and introduced myself, and then sent him questions, and he would answer them. And so I just started doing that.
Was that to the Marvel offices or like to his address?
Well, I wrote to the companies, and then they would forward. I would write, John Romita in care of Marvel Comics, and they would evidently forward them, and then I would get a letter straight from the artist, whether it was John Romita or Gene Colan or any number of other artists, and then their return address would be on it, their personal address, and then I would start writing to them from then. That was before you could really make phone calls. Long distance phone calls cost a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And my parents were very supportive, but they weren't that supportive. Mm-hmm. So I couldn't make any phone calls, but I could write to them. And so I started doing that, and I started actually meeting artists. Well, I went to the 1969 New York Comic Art Convention. My dad drove me up there. My dad's parents lived in New York. They still lived in Queens, so we could combine this trip that he must have considered this wacky exercise.
Is that the one that Hal Foster and Gil Kane were there?
Yeah.
Yeah, you were at that dinner, right? With all those tables, that famous picture?
Luncheon, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was fun. Fantastic. That was a fantastic convention. I mean, I met all of these people whose work I'd read, and I mean, Gil Kane and I knew who Hal Foster was, but I didn't know him that well. But that was my introduction to him, really, and all of these cartoonists were there. Al Williamson was there. I knew who he was, and I would meet them, and I would get their I would get their autographs. So that was kind of that was a real seminal influence on me, because they were real. They were real people.
Yeah, it's like a pilgrimage in a way, right?
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't have been more thrilled. And then that encouraged me to put on my own convention in Washington, which I did. I think I put on a convention in 1970.
That's the MetroCon.
Yeah.
70 and 71, I think you did 2 years.
70, 71.
Yeah.
And you interviewed people like Sal Buscema and stuff doing that, right?
Yeah. Well, Sal Buscema lived in Springfield.
Yeah.
And he was one of the earliest cartoonists I met, because he lived about 20 blocks away from me. Mm-hmm. And I somehow learned that he lived in Springfield, which I couldn't believe. So I somehow mustered up the courage to give him a call.
Yeah.
And, he was incredibly gracious and incredibly patient. I was probably about 15. And he let me come over to his place, and you know, on a Saturday or a Sunday, and he would just sit down with me for a couple of hours and talk to me.
Yeah.
And of course, I would pepper him with all kinds of idiotic questions about what he was working on and the Avengers, and, you know, the characters he was doing and who he liked to ink him, and on and on and on. And you know, and I would do this every 6 months, you know, for as much, you know, I'd have to muster up the courage to give him a call again, because I knew I was imposing and wasting his time.
Mm-hmm.
And then each time he would say, yeah, come on over, and, you know, we can sit down. He gave me a lot of original art. He gave me a lot of pencil pages that were never published.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he would self-reject them. He would do a page, and then he wouldn't like the storytelling or the drawing or something, and he would just say, would you like to have this? And of course I did. And I still have those pages. So,
oh, how fun.
And he did very complete pencils, I have to say.
Yeah, that's right. And I had read that he was in the military, and that's why he was at that Washington, D.C. area, and that's why he ended up living close to there. He developed a lot of bonds in that area. And that's cool. You happen to be right there. That's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, he was literally like a 5-minute drive away.
Mm-hmm. And so then when you were talking to different creators like this, and then like you said with the comic art convention, did you then start to feel pretty comfortable as a journalist in a way, like a budding journalist, that I can talk to these people, I can get answers, I can be inquisitive with them? How did that all, is that the attitude that started to develop around that time?
You know, I don't know if I formulated coherent enough thought to think of myself as a journalist. I mean, I was just such a passionate fan.
I got you.
That I wanted to do this, and I'm not sure at that point I considered it. I'm not sure I considered myself a journalist or what I was doing journalism. You know, it was this fan activity.
Right. And your dad sounds like he facilitated it. He wanted you to get into something fun like that.
Yeah. Well, of course, you know, of course, I couldn't put on a convention at the age of 16 without an adult signing certain documents. So he was very involved in that. And, you know, when I put on the convention, that's when I really had to interact with professionals, and that's when I had to talk to them and cut deals with them. And, you know, I had to get people to come down from New York to Washington to go to this convention, which means I had to give them a room, and I had to arrange their travel, and I had to, you know, I had to, you know, appear like I knew what I was doing. And that's when I started really being introduced to a lot of professionals that had a big impact on my life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, people like, you know, Bernie Wrightson and Mike Kaluta, you know, that whole generation.
Right. And those are true artists as well, right? They could do fine art even. Yeah.
Well, they were great. They were a new generation. They were about 5, 6, 7 years older than me, which at that time meant a lot. I mean, you know, they were like grown-ups, and they were forging their lives, and they represented something new in comics. I don't think I probably had the wherewithal at that time to realize the differences that they were bringing to comics, but, you know, they sort of eschewed the whole hack ethos. You know, comics was really a hack media. I mean,
well, they had the same guys doing comics for like 30 years up to that point, right?
Yeah. And as you probably know, Marvel and DC, there was a period of a decade where they weren't hiring any new artists.
Yeah.
They got all the artists they needed. And that
I read this Stan Lee interview where he was like, "Oh, only there's no new artists in, but we got this new guy, Jim Steranko, kind of a fan that likes comics. He turned out pretty good." That was a 1968 interview. How'd you feel about Steranko when he came on the scene?
Oh my God, I love Steranko. I mean, I worshipped his work. I mean, unfortunately, I worshipped him.
Tell us about that interview with him and that Fantastic Fanzine and how you guys met and Tell us about that a bit.
Well, I can't remember how we met. I probably met him at a convention. I have a lot of photos of him that I took. So I deduced from that I probably met him at in 69 or 70 or 71 at a convention. I was a huge fan of his work, as many of us were. I mean, he was doing work that looked innovative at that time. I mean, in retrospect, I think it's a little, it's less so, but he was doing work that was fresh and interesting, and he was breaking out of the conventional comics format. Marvel was pretty much a child of Kirby. So every artist, drew in the Kirby mode, and even though you can see a lot of Kirby and Steranko, he brought a lot of other influences to it. And so, he looked like this, amazingly fresh talent. And as you could probably tell from your own interview with him, he builds an aura of, he creates his own mystique. And he had that mystique going for him then. He was younger than most of the professionals at that time. He would walk around conventions in turtleneck sweaters and pink jumpsuits and wraparound sunglasses. And he kind of hulls this self-mythology everywhere he goes. And I was mesmerized by him and his work. It's sort of like it's a little like escaping a cult. Finally, when you realize, well, there's less to this than meets the eye. So I met him. Yeah, I met him in 70 or 71. I mean, as you probably know, I worked for him in 73.
73?
We're going to get to that in a few minutes.
But I did. In the interview, I did the interview with him. My dad drove me up to Reading, Pennsylvania.
Oh yeah. Okay. Cool.
I was 16. I mean, you can probably track these dates better than I can. I think I was 16.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 1970. He was right when he left Marvel, and he was venting about Saul Brodsky and things like that.
Yeah,
but
so
he had done a cover. He had done a cover the preceding issue that was inked by Joe Sinnott. That was issue 10, and then 11 was the interview.
That's correct. Yeah. I bought what happened is he didn't do that cover for my fanzine. I bought a pencil rendition from him, and because I had also befriended Joe Sinnott, I asked Joe if he would ink it. And Joe, who is an absolute sweetheart, and whose interview I put up on the Comics Journal website last week, the interview that I did with him with two of my friends, I asked Joe if he would ink it, because I thought, all pencils should be inked, and he inked it, and then I ran it on the fanzine. And then I interviewed Steranko. My dad drove me up to Reading. I interviewed Steranko during the day, and I think into the early evening. My dad just dropped me off and left us. Now, there's the whole Steranko experience, and he lived in a small apartment. It had kind of muted lighting. There was some soft jazz playing in the background. It was kind of Chet Baker-ish.
This sounds exactly like him. Yeah, I know that experience. Yeah.
And it was the whole experience. I mean, it was 1970, you say, so I would have been 15 or 16, depending on when in 1970. And it was great. I mean, he tolerated me, which was nice. I mean, I was a worshipful fanboy, so it probably wasn't too hard to tolerate me. But I think he saw me, as someone who could be useful to him. And we talked on the phone, not infrequently. Which was always kind of exciting. Talking to Steranko. And that led to...
what was that influential on you? What, in a positive way, as far as what path you would go forward in? I mean, I know that you had the issues with actually living with him and all that, but that moment, that interview, he saw something in you that he felt was special. In some way, did that was that a positive influence on you?
Well, I don't know if he saw anything particularly special about me. I mean, he saw an enthusiastic kid that was putting out a decent fanzine with some rudimentary skills that I think he thought could be helpful later on. So yeah, I don't think he saw anything particularly promising.
So you don't, looking back, you don't feel like it was more of a positive patriarchal moment. You don't. It sounds like you have almost more of a maybe a negative. It sounds more negative the way you address it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, he's, well, he said something in your interview. I watched the first part of your interview. Mm-hmm. And he told an anecdote about him going to Tower, I think it was, and
right.
going to Sam Schwartz,
yeah.
And submitting the brilliant Secret Agent X. Mm-hmm. And Schwartz apparently was criticizing him and telling him how he wanted him to do it. And Jim said something to the effect that he thought he was grooming him to be a slave boy. Do you remember that term? It's kind of a weird term that Jim used. And he almost punched him out.
Right.
He indicated he was being condescending. And I heard that, listened to that a couple of days ago. And it was a little shocking because that's exactly how I felt working for him. Mm-hmm. Except for the punching out part. I never considered that. But, I'm not sure. I don't know if I'm saying he turned into Sam Schwartz, but
no, I say you're saying there's a bit of a you're feeling like a mirror irony in some way.
Yeah. So I mean, Jim obviously has a gigantic ego, but I thought he could be, somewhat, looking back on it, I think he could be somewhat manipulative.
I see.
And especially when I was 16, 17 years old.
Impressionable.
Yeah.
I would say this about Steranko. I think I love the guy, and you listen. And there's probably a lot of excitement when I was talking to him, and something I do respect about what he did in the 60s was Stan was just telling everybody, just do it like Kirby, and then he actually brought in the influence of like movies and things and different sorts of visuals in a field that guys that were really old were still doing it, and they were all like stuck in this way. And I feel like he kind of wedged it open creatively for some other stuff where Stan was like, okay, we could kind of get some new stuff going on. And I thought that's important.
Well, I think it's fair. I don't know how important it is, but I think that's fair. I think it was Kriegstein who said very emphatically that comics were not movies. And I think Jim was trying to make comics into movies. I think that was fundamentally wrong-headed, but that you're right that he brought that in, that fresh perspective into comics. I mean, with slicing the page up into many more panels, trying to imitate cinematic conventions. It's undeniable he brought that in. I just think in retrospect, it just looks pretty hollow. I mean, he's still dealing with the same old crap, he's still dealing with that, all of those, those pulp soap opera conventions that Marvel traded in. Just gave it a new dressing, borrowing from Eisner and, throwing a little Dolly in. I mean, he was throwing in all these references. I tend to think a big influence, I don't know if you asked him this, but I think a big influence on him might have been Krapax, Guido Krapax, Italian cartoonist.
Yeah, I mean, he definitely knows about those guys. Yeah.
Yeah, Krapax was slicing up the page
You can see it.
before
I got my
Steranko
Krapax book right here.
It's blending, Jim. I can't see it.
Yeah, I can't see it.
Oh, there it is.
It was in the dark dimension at
It's
that
your
moment.
book. That's all I'm saying.
It is.
But also, I mean, I know. I would say also that he's like unique personality. He has a lot of different skills. When I met him, it's obviously as like a 40-year-old guy, right? Who, so it's a different feeling maybe. But one thing I would say is he's very incisive, like from person to person. Like he can almost like read minds a little bit. And I'll say that he did, as far as his influence on me, is very positive in that he actually like inspired a lot of my motion comic stuff that I do. That he critiques it and we go back and forth on it. And I guess I just want to get it out there that that I highly respect his work, and I just wanted to throw it out there.
You feel compelled to do that.
So going back to Fantastic Fanzine, besides the Steranko interview, because there were others, I was interested in, by mail back and forth, you did an interview with Barry Smith, and he was a kid himself at this point, right? Was he about 19 or 20?
Well, Barry is 5 years older than me. So when I was 15, he was 20, and when I was 16, he was 21. So yes, I was corresponding with Barry when he was living in England.
That's what I thought. How did that happen?
Well, he started out at Marvel. He was the best Kirby imitator at Marvel, and of course, I love Kirby. So therefore, I love Barry, and that's why I must have written to him, and I must have written to him in care of Marvel. And they must have forwarded the letter to him, and Barry must have written to me. I have a whole file of letters from Barry.
Oh wow!
A lot of handwritten letters in Barry's very lovely calligraphic handwriting. And we had a correspondence. I mean, I forget. I mean, I'd have to revisit all the letters from him to me. I don't have any letters from me to him, thank God. But we had a correspondence. He would send me drawings, which I published in the fanzine. Nice little spot illustrations of Marvel characters that he would pencil and ink out of the kindness of his heart. I didn't pay him a penny, and so we had a correspondence going. And then I met Barry. The first time I met him was in New York. Once again, my dad drove me up to Manhattan, and I was probably 16. And Barry was living in an apartment. And so if I was 16, that would have made him 21. And so I go up to the apartment, knock on the door, and he opens it up, and he's like this tall, dapper Englishman, with this great English accent. And I'm just this, suburban kid. And I walk in, and it's a big apartment. And my recollection is it had a piano, bookcases, nice furniture, and it was just sort of overwhelming. And we sat down, and I don't remember if I interviewed him or if we just talked. But I spent a few hours with him, and he too is incredibly gracious and accommodating and patient. with this kid. And later on, he told me that that was not his apartment. It was a friend's apartment, and he was staying there because he had no place to live. Marvel wasn't paying him enough to have an apartment like that. Marvel was paying him enough to, have some studio apartment somewhere in the, village without heat.
Was he actually on the street at one point? I had heard when he.
Well, I might have heard that. I think, Marvel probably wasn't paying him very much. I shouldn't say that without knowing, but I think I might have heard that myself. But yeah, I think, Marvel wasn't paying artists, like very new artists, young artists, very much money. I know that when I was offered a job at Marvel, which was exactly at the same time as Steranko offered me the job with him, I don't think I could have survived on the pay that Marvel was offering me. I forget what it was at that time, but
is that the main reason why you turned that down?
That was the main. Yeah, there were a couple of reasons. Roy Thomas offered me a job at Marvel, and gave me the salary. And I asked my dad, because I didn't have any experience living on my own, except at in college when I lived in a dorm. And I asked my dad, can I live in New York on this money? And he said, no. So I went back to Roy and I said, my father says, I couldn't live in New York. And Roy said, well, that's probably true, but we can give you freelance work to beef it up.
Yeah. So
then I thought, well, I'm going to be working for Marvel 8 hours a day in the office. Then I'm going to be working for Marvel all night, doing freelance work. And that didn't really sound appetizing. And then the other operative factor was that I'd have to give up my car. So, all of these combined, and I very politely turned him down.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So when you were 17, before just a couple years before that, we discussed that you went to Rochester Institute of Technology, which was a leading printing school, which I'm sure came in handy at some point. But it wasn't what you were thinking it was.
No, I'm glad I went there. It was a academically rigorous school, and unlike anything I'd experienced before, because I kind of slept through high school. I was a mediocre student. Little was asked of me, and little was given. And this was the first rigorous academic environment I'd ever been in. And so I actually had to pay attention.
And is that where you were working for the magazine and started to actually do interviews in terms of not fanzine, but doing it as part of?
Well, they had the college had a magazine, a campus magazine, and I got a job there being a reporter. Which was good. I just did stories. They assigned me stories. And so I was not only learning things academically about printing and design and typography and so forth, but I was learning something about being a journalist, because I was writing stories that I didn't have any personal passion for, but they would assign me stories. And so I had to do research, and I had to interview people, and then I had to compose the story. I remember I did this sounds ridiculous, but I did a story about the elevators in the campus dorms, because the goddamn elevators were so slow. And I learned a lot about Otis elevators.
Ah, sure.
They're one of the big, apparently they're among the big elevator manufacturers in the country. So I did my research, and I learned a lot about that. So I would do these stories about subjects I, personally had no interest in, but which forced me and disciplined me to learn how to research. And I did that for the year I was there.
Now, after that first year, did you transfer directly from there to Montgomery Community College, or did you take time off?
There was like 6 months between those two. I went to Rochester for a year, came back home, not knowing what I wanted to do or where I wanted to go, but knowing I didn't want to continue in Rochester. You know, knowing that that just wasn't quite right for me. I mean, I didn't want to be a printer. But then not knowing really what I wanted to do with my life. I mean, I was floundering around. You know, which probably accounts for my taking a job with Steranko.
Well, yeah, because I joked that I asked him a little bit. I was like, well, was it like you were like Professor X and he's like a wayward teen? Like, and he said that you guys worked together. He didn't say very much about it. like the Professor Xavier school. Right.
Well, it'd be like that if Professor X were a masochist, yeah.
But so Montgomery Community College, Northern Virginia Community College, and then working as a clothing salesman. That was all in a certain block of time where you were trying to figure out what to do.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, and you can tell. I mean, just by that that resume, you can tell I didn't know what the hell I wanted to do. Yeah, I was working as a clothing salesman in a jean shop. I mean, it wasn't like a real clothing salesman. It was, I worked in a jean place, and by God, I learned a lot about jeans and all the different brands. And I did that for I did that at the same time. I worked in this. I got a job, and I went to 2 community colleges. And I just took courses I wanted to take. So I took silkscreen printing at Virginia Community College and a couple of other courses. And then I took that creative writing course at Montgomery Community College, which is in the suburbs of Maryland. And probably another course or 2 there. I couldn't take that many because I was also working. And I just didn't really know what I wanted to do. With my life, I was really at ends because I couldn't figure out what to do. I think I was probably going through something of a crisis because I knew I didn't want to enter the corporate world. I knew enough to know I didn't want to do that. But I didn't see any alternative to that.
Now,
so I was stuck.
In trying to do my timeline, I wasn't quite sure. Did you end the Fantastic Fanzine completely before you went to work for Steranko, or was there some overlap?
Yeah, I did. I think I ended it after I left high school.
And Alan Light published it, right?
Yeah, he published He published like 2 issues of it, I think.
Oh, okay.
1 or 2 issues of it.
And that caused some problems down the road, right?
Yeah, we had problems too. Yeah, I'll have to talk about some people I didn't have problems with, but yeah, he approached. Well,
we like problematic Groth. That's like
right. He approached me. I guess it was my last year of high school, and he approached me. He was creating a dynasty, and he approached me and asked me if I'd be interested in having him publish the fanzine. And I don't know, for some reason I think he was going to take over all the economic headaches. I mean, he was going to deal with all that. And that was never something I was interested in. I was never interested in being a businessman. My dad did all that work. He was the one who kept all the books. I was mostly interested in just putting together the magazine. I was never interested in that. So Alan Light came along and he said he would publish it, and we struck a deal. I don't know if he was paying me anything, or if he was, it had to be nominal. But he would pay for the printing. He would deal with all that. He would deal with subscriptions. He would just deal with all the stuff I didn't really want to deal with. But the last issue, I'm pretty sure I published that in my last year of high school, and then I went to college, where I published a couple of other things. I published a fanzine called Word Balloons, which I thought was a great sophisticated leap from Fantastic Fanzine, which it was slightly. And I published a couple of other things when I was in Rochester. I published a little comic of Dennis Fujitaki's work.
Right.
So I was still somewhat involved in publishing when I was in Rochester. I don't know if that answers your question or not. I think I'm just rambling about.
No, you're not at all. And we can get to a little bit more about Alan Light once you start Comics Journal and that first editorial that you did, but we'll save that. So please. Alex, 1973, and now Steranko again.
Right.
You're the Steranko guy.
Yeah, that's right. So now you already mentioned in 73, because we've kind of gone a little back and forth in our timeline, but Roy Thomas, you turned it down, you started working with Steranko, and I've heard some of your accounts of this already, that working with him, and then from right when you stepped in to right when you left, you've mentioned a few things that you felt you weren't able to provide your own creative input into Media Scene and all that stuff, but was working on Media Scene in any way influential in how you would put your Comics Journal and other publications together?
It was influential in the sense that that experience indicated what I shouldn't do. I'll give you one example. Now, I was 19 and I was relatively clueless.
And wayward. You were a wayward teen as well.
I was wayward. That might be putting a little romantic spin on it, but yeah, I'll take wayward. But I had some sense of things. And so at one time, and all I did in his place was scut work. I mean, I did some paste ups. I mean, I really didn't do anything that was worth a shit. But Media Scene, you've seen it, right?
Yeah.
Nobody watching this has probably ever seen a copy or cares about it. But
I have most of them, I think.
Yeah, I have most of them too. But it's not still being published, right?
No.
I mean, it turned into media. I mean, it was Media Scene. Then
it turned into Preview Magazine, right?
Yeah. I mean, it was basically a sort of Entertainment Weekly.
Yeah, in the 80s, it turned into Entertainment Weekly, right? And then, but in the 70s, it was still kind of in that comic scene / media scene, like newspaper print format.
Yeah.
Where they still had a comic section, and they would talk about movies and things. I think it was once he started publishing, or rather, once it started going through Larry Flynt and it turned into a Slick magazine, then it was basically like the pre-Entertainment Weekly of its time, right?
It went through Larry Flynt?
Yeah. See, how do I know this and you don't know this? I don't get it.
I stopped following Steranko's career closely after about 1975. But
there you go.
Did Larry Flynt, was he involved in publishing?
No. Yeah, he that's who put out the Slick magazine.
Really?
Yeah. They never met though. I asked him already.
It was Jim and Larry Flynt. All right.
Well, because you mentioned, I remember I saw you talked to Barry Smith. You talked about the magazine. I think there was some mention about some of the naked women in the back of the magazine, like that would kind of skeeve you out or something.
Oh no, I don't think I don't think so. I had no moral judgment about it. It would support the whole enterprise. That stuff, he sold a lot of. He had a mail order business going,
right? And
I gathered that substantially supported.
Yeah, financially, right? Because Eros did the same for you guys at some point.
Yeah, absolutely, right? Absolutely, right. I don't remember having any problem with that. I hope I didn't. But where was I?
So we were working on media. I did some pay stubs.
Did working for that pave the way? No, but I'll give you one anecdote.
Okay.
And that is, so as you know, preview, Media Scene, and then Preview, they covered movies.
Yeah.
And they sort of previewed all the Hollywood movies that were coming out, and then all the comic books that were coming out. Steranko was a little ahead of his time in foreseeing the moronization of culture, where comics become the culture.
Okay.
You know, they become cinema culture. And so, you know, so media scene was full of comics and, you know, and movies. But this was before movies had become nothing but comic book movies. So he would have, so before the movie came out, movies, you know, came out in the theater, he would have previews of them with the title of the movie, a short take, and maybe a still. And you would get these stills from the studios who were sending them to him for publicity's sake. So at one point I came to him and there'd be a synopsis of the plot.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? I'm sorry. I think these came out after the movie. There were reviews of the movie, ostensibly reviews of the movie. And so I came to him one day and I said, you know, could I write some reviews, some movie reviews? Because of course, one of my few ambitions was to maybe write film criticism.
Yeah, critique stuff.
So I said, you know, I think I could write reviews as good as what you're running, you know. And I pointed out to a couple of reviews, and I said, this is not very good, and this is just a plot synopsis, and you know, and the actual critical content of the review was so meager that I thought I could do a better job. And he looked at me and he said, I don't need you to do that. And I said, well, who's writing these reviews anyway?
Right.
It didn't have a name, you know, they weren't bylined. And he said, I just take studio press releases and rewrite them.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And so I remember, I mean, I distinctly remember standing there talking to him about this. And I remember thinking there's something wrong about that. Passing off rewritten studio press releases as reviews, you know, as independent reviews appearing in this magazine. And, you know, I mean, I don't think we talked about it that much. I mean, I think I tried to persuade him that I could maybe, you know, inject a little bit of critical content into the magazine, but, you know, he wasn't having it. It's not what he wanted. It's not what the magazine was about. He wasn't interested. So, you know, so in a way, yes, it did influence me in terms of what not to do.
Mm-hmm. Were you living in the house at this same time? Were you living in the
house? Oh, yeah, we were all living in his house. He had a gorgeous, big townhouse.
So this is like a different place than when you interviewed him a couple years before.
Yeah. When I interviewed him, you know, when I was 15 or 16, he was living in a small apartment.
Mm-hmm.
And he'd obviously acquired enough success to buy this big Victorian townhouse. It was beautiful. It was at least 2 floors, maybe 3.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, really spacious. And I lived on the ground floor with Ken Brusnick. You know who Ken is?
Sure, the letterer.
The famous letterer. So he and I were on the ground floor, and Steranko's studio and his living quarters were above.
So I want to throw something out there.
I felt about Steranko then as you apparently feel about him now.
No. I'm not saying I mean, I'm 40-year-old guy. I'm not, you know, I'm not a wayward teen that, you know, that is worshiping him. That's not it. But right. I want to. I was a
little worried.
But I want to throw out there a couple things about it. Is now at his time in 1970 or 1970 to 72, and then you got it in on him at 73 like that. When he put out the History of Comics volumes, and he was doing, you know, illustration for covers and book covers and things.
Yeah.
And he's putting out a magazine as a publisher. You know, I don't recall. And putting out some pretty interesting designs in general. I don't recall anyone coming to that caliber of expression from a commercial and artistic standpoint before that. You're
talking about what year? 70.
Looking at that and what he was doing in those few years there.
Yeah.
There's very few people like that, for one. And I think we should just kind of say that there's very few people at that time, especially, that could do that. This is before internet. This is before image, and before people were just movers and shakers. for where he was at that time, I think that's a pretty interesting person. It's a unique person, and that's all I'm saying. And I wouldn't want to take credit away from that, but I get what you're saying, because when you actually are with a person day in, day out, and now you're seeing realities of the everyday thing, that's a different experience. And I get what you're saying. I'm not disagreeing with, and what you guys said. I mean, that's before I was born, right?
And
so,
I don't. Yeah, and I don't want you. Yeah, and I don't want you to think I'm conflating my personal experience with my critical judgment.
Right.
I don't think I am. I mean, I try to separate the two, and I think you have to do that with every artist, which is now out of fashion.
Yeah.
I mean, I like Roman Polanski's films.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because they're great.
Right. Well, what was that?
Want to hang out with Roman.
What did he make? Quaalude Heaven? Something? No, I'm kidding. I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't do that.
But no, I try to separate that out. So I'm not conflating those two. Sure, you have a point, but when your baseline, I don't want to spend the entire time talking about, Jim, but when your baseline is just the most, mediocre hackwork.
Before him, yes.
Yeah. Or during that period from
or even during, with the other people. Yeah.
1970 to 75, it was a terrible period, in
totally.
mainstream comics, and you're comparing them, primarily to mainstream comics and not to other comics.
Right.
You're not comparing them to the kind of personal expression that you found in underground comics that they were championing long before. I mean, what he was doing is, rearranging pulp and comic book cliches in a different way. So depending on how valuable you find that, and I don't find that particularly valuable, your assessment of him will be based on that.
Right.
I was looking.
You're looking at like what it could be, and there's a lot of amazing creative people that came after, and I get what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. Are you going to edit this?
Maybe, I don't know.
Well, I'll tell you. Here's one thing. Here's one area where it might have influenced me. I worked for him for 3 months.
Yeah.
And that was in 73. I started the Comics Journal in 76. So that was still 3 years later. So I still had 3 years of, living to do.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was kind of flailing around. And when I was working for him, without going into any more details, and I only worked there for like 3 months. So I didn't know what I wanted to do. I had no idea what I wanted to do, but I did know what I didn't want to do. And what I didn't want to do was eat shit.
Yeah, right.
And I knew that if I continued working for him, I would be eating shit.
Yeah.
And
that's like that assistant to Stanley Kubrick. Like that guy that guy got weird.
Yeah, but Kubrick's brilliant. I mean, nothing against Steranko, but Kubrick could kill me and I would accept it. I mean,
no, I know. It's just that assistant that he had just really he was warped toward the end of all that. So I get what you're saying.
No, and I'm sure Kubrick did have his idiosyncrasies. But I think it is a false analogy, because Kubrick's work, even though I think it ranges all over the place, even though I think Paths of Glory and Dr. Strangelove are absolute masterpieces.
Yeah.
But they're masterpieces on a level that Steranko can't come close to. And that kind of goes to the heart, using that analogy, that goes to the heart of the distinction I was trying to make when I started the Comics Journal between films and comics, and what comics could be and what they were capable of and the level of artistic expression they were capable of. I mean, I'm leaping a little bit of ahead, but that's that's the conclusion I came to. Probably over that 3-year period from the time I left Steranko until I started the Comics Journal.
Right.
You know, I educated myself over that period.
Well, let's talk about that period, because
that was a rich period. I mean, in my life.
So you're there at Steranko. Steranko says, you got to go away for a few days. I'm doing stuff. And you were like, where am I going to go? I live here. And you have enough, and you pack up, you call your friend, and you guys just drive into the city and go see Howard Chaykin. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's true. Yeah.
All right. So from that moment, and then it's like, what do I do now? But were you already friends with Mike Catron, and he was already enrolled at University of Maryland? Right?
We were buddies from the time we were about 15, because he was a comics nut and I was a comics nut. We were the same age. I think we're literally 1 month apart.
Is he the guy that picked you up from Steranko's house?
Yeah. He drove up from Maryland. He was going to the University of Maryland.
Right.
And he drove up. He picked me up at Steranko's because Steranko told me to go. Now Steranko told me I had to leave for a few days.
Right.
So he could paint in an empty house. And so we drove up to New York. We had nothing to do. So we drove up to New York and we crashed around a few places. I'm pretty sure that I stayed at Howard's place one night. I think he put us up for one night. And we were up there for a few days, and I talked to Mike about this recently, and we can't remember who else we stayed with, but we banged around New York for a few days. I distinctly remember being in Howard's studio, small studio, and us talking. And of course, Howard, again, is like a few years older than me and old enough to make a difference back then, you know. And he was a working professional at the time. And then we drove back to Steranko's, and Steranko told me that I hadn't been gone long enough, so I had to leave again. So then I went down to Mike's place for a few days, but then I went back to Steranko's and I stayed there another month or so.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, I didn't leave at that time. I went back and stayed another month or month and a half or something.
It's like Michael Corleone.
Yeah, exactly.
Did Bruce know Chaykin at that point?
I don't think so.
So you knew both of them, but they didn't know each other.
No, I don't think they did. No. Ken led a very sheltered life at that time, I think.
Did he get along with Steranko better than you? Was he able to navigate that better?
Ken was far more accommodating than I was.
Right.
I mean,
he said that he was a lot more laid back about it or something.
He was. He accepted it. And, you know, and honestly, I mean, I accepted it. There wasn't much I could do but accept it. But I just knew it wasn't a good long-term situation. You know, there was tension.
Now, you were getting more and more politicized at this point as well. And like me, you were obsessed with Watergate. I was pretending I was sick to stay home to watch the hearings and things. I was crazy about all of that going on. And you were actually a little older, so you were in college, and you went to University of Maryland, where your friend was attending. He was in his second year. You went there for 1 year.
I transferred,
yeah. And at that point, so you're there, and Nixon and DC is imploding. And I read that you actually went to the White House the night that Nixon resigned to celebrate.
Well, you know, I don't think I was there the night he resigned. I was there a couple of times at what we call the Nixon Death Watch.
Right.
There was just a group of people, hundreds of people, across the street from the White House, who would just set up camp. And people would come and people would go, and some people would just stay there for weeks. And I would join them a couple of times. And of course, it was called the Nixon Death Watch because we were just waiting for him to leave. But unfortunately, I was not there the day or the night he left. But yeah, I was obsessed. We were both obsessed with Watergate. Of course, we were living in Washington, so we were reading the Washington Post every day. And every day
Woodward and Bernstein an influence? Did they make you want to be explore the reporting angle?
They made everybody want to be a journalist.
I was a journalism major too, and that was why.
Everybody. I mean, it was terrible. The effect they had, on journalism schools was terrible. I majored in journalism at the University of Maryland, and yes, I was interested in being a journalist. But we had these huge classes because everybody wanted to be a journalist. Everyone saw the glamour of Woodward and Bernstein, and of course, I want to think that I wanted to be a real journalist. But as a result of so many people taking journalism classes, the classes I thought were really dumbed down. I remember one class assignment was to go home and read the newspaper. And I was thinking, that's like the baseline. Everybody should be doing that anyway. And so I remember being frustrated by what was being taught and how quickly it was being taught. And I wanted to learn more faster. And that's one of the reasons I dropped out.
So you dropped out in 1975, partly because of that. Were you also just over your head busy because of the rock and roll concert?
Yeah. Mike and I came up with this idea to put on a rock and roll convention. And I think I dropped out of the university. I think it was either late 74, early 75. I couldn't keep up with classes. We started working on this idea in August or September of 74. And our idea was that if, I put on comic book conventions, so I knew how to put on a convention. And, I knew the logistics, I knew how to get a hotel, I knew how to get guests, I knew how to put together a dealer's room, and we could just duplicate the format of a comics convention to a rock and roll convention. And because rock and roll was so much more popular than comics, we would get so many more people and make so much more money. And then we would take that money and we would start a publishing company. That was our grand plan. We didn't really want to be rock and roll entrepreneurs. We wanted to be publishers.
Yeah, make money real first.
Right. So that was our plan. So we spent literally, almost a year working on this rock and roll convention. We conceived the idea, and we put it all together. And I can't even really begin to describe what that was like. It started slowly and built. And there was a point where we were working literally 16 to 18 hours a day.
Yeah. On
this, both of us. And, at some point, I couldn't take classes anymore because I wasn't paying attention to them, and I wasn't, I couldn't pass them. I couldn't do the work. And I think we both dropped out. And so we put this thing on. It was over the July 4th holiday at a big hotel in downtown Washington, D.C. in 1975. And it came off. We had all the guests, and we had a big dealer's room, and we had a film. We had a screening room with films, and it was just a complete bust. We lost more money than we had ever seen in our lives.
Wow. So more than $10,000 was lost.
Yeah. Well, we lost $15,000. Well, I'll tell you, we were $15,000 in debt, which at that point in my life, it was like $15 million.
Especially at that time, that's a lot.
I was 19, 20. I was 19 when we put it on, and I guess I was going to turn 20 in September.
How much was a joint back then?
I don't know. I never smoked. I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's my unit of measurement. So no.
Right.
Speaking of that, Hunter S. Thompson is part of this story too. So we should.
Yeah, we got Hunter S. Thompson to speak there. He was a hero of mine. I loved his work. Reading him kept me alive and kept me sane. I read his. I would read him in Rolling Stone, and I read all of his books, but his On the Campaign Trail, Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail.
Yep.
Which I think might be his masterpiece. You know, I thought that was just such a brilliant book. And it was a brilliant take on politics at that time. You know, I wanted to get, I mean, you know, and he was synonymous with rock and roll at that time. You know, he was appearing regularly in Rolling Stone, and he would make, you know, he would often reference rock. So I wanted to get him in there as a kind of political component to the Rock and Roll Expo. And I contacted the Rolling Stone Lecture Bureau, which they had at that time, and cut the deal. We had to pay them up front to get him to appear, and he did appear.
Oh, cool.
I mean, it was shaky. We didn't know he was going to show up until the last minute, and I had to go out. I had to actually go from the convention, get in my car, and drive to his hotel and pick him up, because somehow he was having trouble getting to the convention.
So would it be fair to say that that Mike at Catron was more of a Woodward Bernstein, and you were more of a Hunter S. Thompson in terms of your approach to journalism?
It actually would, yeah. That's very good.
Great. All right. So you did that. And you stayed in touch with Thompson to some degree, in that you drove to his house at one point, which is a dangerous thing to do.
Yeah. Well, I can't say I stayed in touch with him. I saw him like after the convention. The convention ended Sunday, and we were, you know, completely demoralized, because we realized we did not, in fact, make our fortune in order to start a publishing company, and had done quite the opposite. We dug ourselves into a huge hole. And so I think we were just sort of in shock. And the next day, for some reason, I got in touch with the Rolling Stone Lecture Bureau, and I don't know why, but I drove down there. They were in DC, and of course I was in Maryland. But I drove down there for some reason, I don't remember why. And Hunter Thompson was in the office, and I'd seen him 2 days earlier, Saturday, I think. And so he knew me, and we started talking. And he had appointments to go to in Washington throughout the city. And he asked me if I would drive him around.
Wow.
You know, chauffeur him around. So I said, fuck yeah. I'll do that.
Yeah, that's great.
And you know, we got in my car, and I just drove him around DC. I would drop him off, and he'd say, okay, you know, I'll be back in an hour. And I would, you know, do something, and then go pick him up, and we go somewhere else. And, you know, in the meantime, when we're in the car, we could talk. And, you know, that was kind of great. And so I did, but, you know, I can't say I really knew him. I mean, I was like, you know, this kid who was willing to drive around Washington, D.C. and pay him to appear at my failed convention. So, yeah, Mike and I, well, in order to pay our rent and to feed ourselves, we decided to go to San Diego that year, which was either in late July or early August, right after the convention we put on. And we decided to go to San Diego and sell comics to make money. It's the only thing we could do to figure out how to make money. So this is when you could call San Diego a week before the convention and buy a booth.
Yeah.
So we did that. We got a table, and we literally made this decision a week before the convention. And we packed up Mike's station wagon, which was this beat up old station wagon. And we got in it and literally drove cross country in one drive. It took us 51 hours to drive across the country to San Diego nonstop. And because I guess we were going through Colorado. You know, we went to San Diego on the southern route. And I guess that takes us through Colorado, but we thought we were close enough to Woody Creek, which is where Thompson lives. We might as well visit him. So we were still 19 at this time. So we thought, yeah, that'd be a good idea to visit Hunter. And, you know, he kind of knew us because, you know, we paid him a lot of money and, you know, and I drove him around DC. So completely unannounced, because I guess I didn't have his phone number. But I did have, I don't know if I had an address or I just had some sense that he lived in Woody Creek and I'd find him. But we went to Woody Creek and somebody must have told us he lives like way up the, you know, up the hill, which he writes about. So he lived up this long, winding road that goes up the mountain. And he lives at the top of this fucking mountain. And we drove all the way up there and, you know, got out of the car, knocked on the door. There was a huge peacock in a cage next to the front door. It's the only thing I really remember, which seemed very Hunter Thompson-ish, you know, and knocked on the door. And I mean, in retrospect, that's crazy because, you know, he might've shot us or something. But no one answered. I mean, he probably wasn't there. And,
no, it sounds like a Doonesbury cartoon. I mean, the way you're describing it.
Did you take a whiz anywhere around the property?
We did not have the wherewithal to do that. I remember getting back in the car and going down. And when you're going down, the cliff is on your right.
Oh wow!
And I remember that just being a terrifying.
Yeah, that's scary.
Drive down.
Yeah, I have a fear of heights. I have a fear of heights and sharks, so I get that.
I have fear of heights too. Yeah.
So yeah, because the music magazine was called Sounds Fine. So when you wanted to be a publisher, when you were putting the rock and roll convention, was that you wanted to be a music publisher, or were you thinking about comics criticism still at this point?
No, look, you know, I don't know what I was thinking about. I'm not sure I was thinking about anything. I mean, I was scrambling to make ends meet. I didn't have a job. We owed all this money. I tell you, I got a job right away, a full-time job, a horrible job.
Yeah. Because
we had to pay back a lot of money. You know, friends had loaned us money, so you know we had to pay this back. So I got a full-time job as a designer at a printing company.
Oh, okay. Mike
got a job doing something, and so we scraped some money together. But then, you know, I'm just not built so that I can just go to work every day and come home and
the 9 to 5 grind
and live like that. Yeah, I couldn't do it. And so the one thing that came out of the rock and roll convention is we had a huge mailing list. We had a mailing list of several thousand people, all presumably rock fans.
Yeah.
And a friend of mine who owned a bookstore at the time told me he would finance a magazine if we could put it all together. And so we created Sounds Fine, which was a rock magazine. Now, honestly, I mean, I shouldn't speak for Mike, but I don't think either one of us had that deep an interest in rock. I mean, we had a dilettantish interest in rock. And really, in all honesty, we were, you know, using the rock and roll convention opportunistically to raise money to establish a publishing company, which is what we really wanted to do. But, you know, he said he would finance a rock magazine. So by God, we were going to put together a rock magazine.
Yeah.
So
that was more introduced upon you, it sounds like.
Yeah, but it was part of our passion of publishing. I mean, we wanted to publish.
Yeah.
And so this gave us the opportunity to conceptualize a magazine, to editorially direct it, to, you know, solicit essays and articles and reviews. You know, Ted White, you know who Ted White is?
No.
Science fiction author who's also a comics fan. He lived in, I think he lived in Arlington, Virginia, so he was sort of a neighbor. And he was also older than us, but he was a comics fan and a science fiction author. So our interests intersected, and he was also an enormous music fan and critic. And so we enlisted him to write a big column, and it was a column on basically avant-garde rock music.
Oh, wow. That's a cool combination of perspective in one person to write an article like that.
Yeah. And Ted knew his shit. I mean, I didn't know anything. But Ted really had a great grasp of what was going on in the avant-garde of rock music at that time. And we just trusted him because we couldn't assess it. But he would write these enormous fucking columns. I mean, he was like a machine. He wrote these columns that must have been 5, 6, 7, 8,000 word columns, and we just let him go. And we thought we were doing some good. We were thought, if we're going to do this rock magazine, let's introduce people to, Mott the Hoople or whatever the hell he was writing about. And we would also, we'd have articles about Dylan and the Beatles and the Stones, and but it gave us the opportunity to employ these skills that we loved using, that I honed doing the fanzine. We used artists, comic artists, to do covers for Sounds Fine. David Mazzucchelli did one.
Oh yeah.
A number of cartoonists who would go on.
How many issues were there of Sounds Fine?
26.
Yeah, so that's a pretty good chapter in your life right there.
Yeah. I mean, it was, we would do it. It would come out, I think it was monthly, and we would crank it out, and we were excited to do it. Never made any goddamn money. I don't know if Mike and I actually made money on it. I don't think so. I think our investor just, kind of broke even, and he invested money occasionally, but we were excited to do it. It gave me the opportunity to write movie reviews.
There you go. Finally.
Since it was our magazine, we could do whatever we wanted. I could write, reviews of movies in it. I remember writing a review of, it's a Kubrick film, Barry Lyndon.
Oh, I love that. A lot of people don't like it, but I love that movie.
Well, my review is very positive. I haven't seen it since, but I remember loving it. It was great just doing that. We set up a place. I had a 2-bedroom apartment. I think we had 1 bedroom that was set up as a kind of a studio where we could put out the magazine, kind of honing our skills. And then in 1976 we started publishing the Journal, but we actually put out both of those at the same time.
Oh, okay.
For a while.
So they actually were side by side. At one point. Yeah. So then you guys purchased the rights to the new Nostalgia Journal or Nostalgia Journal. How'd that come about as far as did you pay for that?
Purchase is putting a spin on it. I mean, they basically gave it to us.
Okay, they just didn't want to do it anymore. Okay.
No, they were burned out, and we approached them because we could see they were burned out. And they were competing with the Buyer's Guide, and we thought we could do a better job, and we thought we could infuse it with some fresh, young blood.
Yeah.
And we offered to take it over, and they were really only too happy to give it to us. They gave us.
That's what Paul Levitt said about his fanzine. He said the same thing. They just it wasn't really a purchase. It was just
the comic reader.
Over.
Yeah. They were tired and they were burned out, and they were tired of fighting, and it was one slog for them because they were competing with Alan Light and the Buyer's Guide, and and Light was just using all of these underhanded tactics to undermine them and sabotage them.
Oh wow!
And we thought we could withstand all of that and make a go of it. Which we didn't really, because we turned it from an advertising-based periodical to a more content-driven periodical. But they just gave it to us. They gave us the mailing list, whatever contents they had, and that was it. And they said, "Good luck." And then it was ours. And then I think we used the same printer we used for the music magazine. We had a local printer who printed it, so we had that locked in. And we had and then we had a new mailing list from them, and we had an advertiser base, so we were off and running.
Yeah, and so then in that first issue, which it ran under the name of Nostalgia Journal for a few issues. Then it went to Comics Journal.
Yeah.
But you wrote an editorial, and Alan Light and Murray Bischoff were mentioned in it, right? And so so tell us about that first editorial and Alan Light and the reaction and all that.
Yeah, I mean, it was. I mean,
you like to poke the bear, right? Isn't that you like that?
I must have, yeah. I mean, I haven't looked at that in a long time, but my recollection of it is that it was immense, and that it was incredibly well researched, and that I just threw everything I had into it, and I basically chronicled what I thought were all of Alan Light's professional transgressions. And I was making the case that, his the comics buyer's guide and his publishing efforts were fundamentally unethical.
Okay.
And of course, I later learned that, you don't acquire an advertising base based on your moral superiority. It's based on your subscriber list.
Mm-hmm.
So, so I mean that article on, I don't know. I mean, it seems like 300 years ago. It caused a big stir. A lot of people were on our side. A lot of people hated it. I guess it was the perfect keynote to the Comics Journal.
Start off with a bang.
It was very, very, it was very partisan.
Wasn't this all on purpose to some degree? I mean, this is the way to launch something, is to be provocative. You got a buzz from it. That wasn't the purpose. I mean, the purpose was to go out with both guns blazing. Right. And to say, this is what we stand for. This is what we stand against. This is why we're doing this. We want to give you an alternative to this. We want to provide an alternative to this. And it was frankly, that the journalist, I mean, I don't want to aggrandize it too much, but I mean, I wanted people to recognize what was going on, what was happening, and how he was behaving. And, I mean, the whole world is different. I mean, if you look at it now, it's just all this penny ante nonsense, I mean.
Are you saying that hashtags aren't good enough journalism for you?
Right. I guess.
Is that what you're trying to say?
Maybe we've come full circle. I mean, back then, I mean, there really wasn't any comics journalism to speak of. There was one magazine called Inside Comics that was edited by a guy named Joe Brancatelli that lasted about 6 issues. And it was the closest comics had come to that point to real journalism. Mm-hmm. But like I said, it lasted like 6 issues, so it barely existed.
So the kind of journals I read tend to be more in the medical field. I read a lot of those, but I will say, and just as I was complimenting Steranko a bit earlier, I will say that your periodical, your comics journal that you've done with Katrin and Kim Thompson, all that, but you put together the closest thing that is possible to those journals that I read that are in a totally different branch. Your comics journal really is the it of that aspiration. I do want you to know I feel that way about you and what you've done, that I do feel that you're also a very special and unique person as well, just so you understand where I'm at with you, and that what you've done with comic history. I've gone through, I think I've gone through all of them up to like 2005 or something.
I was just going to suggest, when I was saying about the buzz, that you came in there strategically with a little bit of Charles Foster Kane to you. Yeah. I mean, that you yes. That's what I'm suggesting. Is there some truth in that?
Yeah, yeah. In fact, we even had, echoing Citizen Kane, we even had like a list of our principles. Do you remember? I don't know if you, I don't know if you have the.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And I'm sure we did that as a kind of ironic homage to Citizen Kane. So yes, I mean, we knew what we were doing, and we knew we were causing a stir, because in comic circles back then, people didn't cause stirs. I mean, there was no journalism. I mean, it was all the kind of fanzines that I published when I was a teenager. It was, worshipful, and your job was to worship the artist, and the artist's job was to be worshipped, and the companies were sacrosanct. You didn't question them or their motives or their practices. And I was starting to question all of that. And that goes back to what I was reading, and that goes back to my own education between 73 and 76 that we were talking about earlier. The wider world had been introduced to me, and I saw how provincial the comics world was. It was this terrible backwater. A cultural backwater, a moral backwater. And I thought that ought to be questioned and challenged.
So let me ask you a question about, so although you were doing new stuff, but when you look at the whole thing at once, is there a formula there? And I'm just going to kind of throw it out there as a question, just to see how you feel about the question, and the answer is: exploring other genres, be anti-superhero, disparage work for hire, mock editor-in-chiefs, and then maybe just bust balls of random, not maybe random, but just of particular creators. And is that the formula? Or is that wrong to say that that's a formula?
Well, I think it's a little too reductionist.
Okay.
I mean, everything you said would have been included in what we did over the next 30 years. But I do think that's a little reductionist, yeah.
Okay.
And, I should say it also, it took us a while to gain our footing. It wasn't like, I kind of had an idea of what I wanted to do. But I didn't start off having any fully formed ideas about us challenging the major companies that were putting out comics. That evolved from where I started. And I think everything you just enumerated became an inevitable consequence of that. I mean, I think inevitably we had to do all of that. We had to challenge work for hire. We had to give artists who were in effect dissidents space to vent their grievances. I remember running pieces by Steve Gerber and Frank Bruner, people who would speak out about the practices under which they were suffering. And this had never been done before. And we felt, this was the time to do it. So we encouraged artists to do that. I mean, in our interviews, we would talk about this, and
and the interviews are genius. Comic Journal has the best interviews. Yes.
Well, our interviews, yeah. I mean, I think there was a point where we started. It took a few years, but I always wanted to publish good interviews.
Yeah. And just some names, just so the audience, I don't know if they know, but Bill Gaines, Harvey Kurtzman, Jack Kirby, Gil Kane, Robert Crumb, Howard Chaykin. I mean, a slew of people, amazing, unique people. And you guys really got into thought-provoking discussions with them.
Yeah. And we interviewed a spectrum of artists, like people in the previous generation. This is a detour, but I am somewhat disheartened by what I perceive to be the ahistorical bent of the younger generation. You know, so many younger cartoonists just don't seem to care about what's preceded them.
And where it all came from.
I mean, unless they can criticize the, you know, political or cultural content of it, you know, which is easy to do. But, you know, I remember, you know, when I was a kid, I was interviewing, you know, guys who were 20 years older, 30 years older than me. And I was, you know, and as I got older and I got into my 20s, I became much more curious about people like Harvey Kurtzman.
You guys had a C.C.Beck saying quite a few interesting things.
Yeah, yeah. I interviewed C.C.Beck in his place in Florida, and he was a much older guy than me at that time. You know, he was in his well, he was probably about my age now, but I was probably about in my late 20s, and I was, you know, intensely curious about his career and his life and what doing comics was like when he was doing them in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah, it's interesting because even though you're obviously of a left-wing political, you know, mindset, you still were printing interesting things from creators like, because C.C.Beck was writing kind of more right-wing stuff sometimes, right?
Well, he was more curmudgeonly than right-wing, I think. I don't think he had any coherent ideology.
I understand. Okay.
A little more conservative, but you know, he was a cranky guy, and I appreciated that.
And then Rick Marshall, whom we've had on the show before, and he's clearly
Rick does have a coherent right-wing ideology. Yeah.
Yes, but he's also like an amazing historian, right?
He's a great historian. Yeah, he knows more about comics than most people are gonna, you know, ever know.
I was very nervous about that interview. I thought that it was going to, because his politics are not mine, and it's one of my favorite interviews that we did on this. He's just a delight to talk to for hours. Yeah.
I kind of had to twist Jim's arm to do it a little bit, but he got into it actually a lot. So.
Well, Rick, I mean, Rick and I keep our politics mostly separate. And you know, we bonded, frankly, over our love of comics and our love of the same artist. I mean, Rick is really peculiar because he's one of the few members of the right wing who's actually cultivated.
Right. He knows a lot.
Yeah.
That was my impression. I just didn't say it out loud.
Yeah. I'll say all these things out loud. But, you know, I mean, he's got wonderful taste, does exquisite taste, and he's a great historian.
So
now we transcended our political differences.
Right. And you've published, I mean, quite a few things that with his name on it, obviously.
Yeah.
So clearly there's a mutual respect. And I think the younger generation needs to learn from these kind of interactions. But I'm going to throw out some sentences that are a little, I don't want to say controversial, but you probably know some of these, I'm sure. But there were times when the Comics Journal would really bust someone's chops pretty good. So obviously you wrote in issue 37, Steranko has a quick, violent temper. He doesn't like being questioned about improprieties he may have approved knowingly or unknowingly. About Don McGregor in the Journal 44, this book's icons also display McGregor's vast literary heritage. He is the paradigmatic member of the post-literate generation, the first generation to grow up on and embrace movies and television, which isn't bad. You said about Jim, okay, not you didn't, but someone else did, about Jim Starlin. Starlin has applied his meager talents to writing and drawing an overpriced, gaudily produced, forgettably inane Marvel comic. And that one's harsh a little bit, but I think of Bill Mantlo. Someone wrote, every day there is more of the cheap, shallow trash you revel in, defend, and produce, and every day there are more people to stand up for it with you. I personally, and then someone else wrote, I can find nothing of interest in your current comics writing. There are just more bricks in the wall of Marvel banality.
You want me to comment on that?
Well, I'm just saying it's a different, interesting trend in that, you guys would zero in on this stuff.
It was, I think that was all absolutely essential,
right?
To put out there, I think these comics had gone far too long without being criticized.
Yeah.
And finally the time had come to apply mature critical standards to what were essentially just relentlessly idiotic and adolescent crap the comics traded in for its entire existence, with very few exceptions. Comics is just such a peculiar medium and industry. Comic books, I'm talking about specifically, but the history of comic books is it's just a history of such just crap, It's just, and my feeling then was that it doesn't have to be that way. Mm-hmm. There can be work of genuine aesthetic value. And that
now,
we ought
what do you think of this sentence? McGregor is peddling as sensitive writing is just the emotional equivalent of pornography. Looking back, do you feel like these are true statements?
I think they're defensible and arguable critical statements. Yeah.
Did Kim Thompson moderate you a little bit in terms of that? When he was there, because I've heard him in interviews explain things that you'd say, and he would say, well, I understand why people were offended by Gary's piece, but they're not quite hearing it right, and was how helpful or how essential was he to Comics Journal at this point? Partly because of that tempering of your, let's say, honesty.
Yeah. Well, several of the harshest things that you just read were by Kim.
Yeah, that one was the porno McGregor, hashtag porno McGregor. Now it would just be hashtag porno McGregor is how that would be now with the current generation. But yeah.
Right. I recalled that when you read it, but Kim actually wrote that.
That's cool.
Kim was not a moderating influence at that time. He was never a moderating influence. He might have tried to be occasionally, but probably never succeeded. I probably became more militant, and Kim probably became less militant over the years. Now, it's funny because you're talking about, you just quoted Kim's review of Don McGregor's, what was the name of the book? Was it Detectives Inc.?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, because that was Journal 59.
But now Kim loved McGregor's work. Absolutely loved it. And if you go back to fanzines that Kim contributed to, I guess in the early 70s, you'll see a lot of rave reviews of Don McGregor from Kim. And Kim, too, had the scales lifted from his eyes at some point and recognized that McGregor, was a terrible writer. So I think we were both undergoing, an education throughout the early days of the Comics Journal. And we were very much in sync. I think Kim started moderating his views at some point. And at some point, I think I hardened my views. Yeah.
Okay, so you hardened him as in like you feel more specifically and more intensely about the same kind of thing.
Yeah. I felt more strongly than ever that the comics were capable of a certain level of aesthetic expression, and that artists, who were doing lousy work were we're really confounding the medium by doing that.
Right. Because I mean, just because a 12-year-old kid buys it doesn't mean it's good, right?
Yeah, but there can be good comics for 12-year-olds. But yeah, of course. I mean, comics have always appealed to children, and that's why they've gotten away with so much junk.
Right. And the creator robbery. I mean, that's because of the kid medium. I think in other mediums it doesn't happen quite as easily.
I have an interview I want to specifically ask you about for a second, which was the Jack Kirby interview that you did. And my only concern about that was the point in time that he was at. It seemed like he said things that have later been used against him to impact his credibility, to say, well, he didn't really do all of that. And you can't say that no one else ever did anything creative, and so forth. It was a hard interview. As you were doing it, did you ever, as a journalist, do you feel like you're supposed to protect the subject? And I would say, no, you shouldn't. But at the same time, there was the fan person in me was like, oh man, this is going to have ramifications, and people are going to quote this on Facebook 50 years from now, because I was that prescient. And so I worry about that. When you were doing journalism, did you ever think about those aspects, the impact it was going to have?
Well, did I mean, I was certainly aware of them. But I'm also from the Oriana Fallacy school of interviewing, where I think that the interview subject has to stand or fall in what he says. And I mean, have I cut out stuff from an interview that I think, for prudential reasons, I probably have. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I probably have. Mm-hmm. But with Kirby, I mean, I caught him at a specific time, and he was angry. And of course, I think he had every right to be angry.
Right.
And I wanted to capture that anger too, because Jack did not express his anger often. He kept it in. He repressed his anger. And at this point, for whatever reason, he decided to let go. And, I mean, he said some things that were exaggerations. He said Stan Lee didn't write a word. That's not true. I think I understood what he was saying. And I think anyone who understands the history of Kirby and Lee's relationship knows what he was saying, which was, of course, that he wrote the stories in the sense that he laid them out, and he wrote notes on the sides of the pages explaining what the action. So he, in effect, wrote the stories, but it was Stan Lee who wrote all the dialogue for the stories. Mm-hmm. And I think everyone knows that. So that was, an exaggeration or a lie, depending on how you want to spin it. But
like when he said he created Spider-Man's costume, was something, were you kind of thinking, okay, no, you didn't, but you let him keep talking? I mean, how'd that go?
I can't tell you what I was thinking at that moment. I really don't. I mean, looking back over that interview, I actually wish that I had prepared more thoroughly than I did. Mm. And you might notice I did that interview in 86, something like that.
No, it was like 91 or so. Not 90. I thought it was like, no. I thought it was later than that. No. I don't know.
No, it had to be
because there was a Joe Simon interview in the same issue.
It had to be before 89. I'm not sure when, 86 or 7 maybe.
Okay.
But I wish I had prepared a little bit more, so I could have delved more deeply into some of the things he said. But I'm not unhappy with that. I think it shows a side of Jack that is too often not shown.
Do you still have that audio tape of it?
Yeah.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah.
So now, two questions about TCJ real quick, and then so Jim Shooter, right? There was a lot of articles on him in the 80s, obviously, right? Yeah. And do you feel that, you know, there's this whole thing of canceling a person these days, cancel culture or whatever, but it wasn't really like to that degree back then. Maybe wasn't there to really in any real way, but a lot of the articles I was just kind of looking back on about him, about Jim Shooter and about work for hire, it seemed maybe, and I could be wrong, and you can correct me if I am, is that it seemed like they were kind of conflating the Kirby original art and lack of creator status and evil Marvel corporate people, and then conflating it with Shooter and kind of his OCD personality and kind of combining it in a way where, could it have been that you had potentially stained his reputation with the baby boomer generation that was reading that to the point where now he wasn't as viable, and now he's in a poorhouse now because he's not as viable?
Well, you're talking about now?
I mean like that. As far as it now, I mean, yeah, he's still alive, right? So, so the stuff that happened back then, did it mess up the fan base where now like no one was interested in him anymore, or did he genuinely mess up his own? Did he mess up? Was he his own worst enemy in that sense?
Yeah. Well, has he been canceled?
I don't think, not in that. No, I'm saying is like more like when people read enough bad things about a person and they don't want to deal with him anymore. That's what I'm.
Well, yeah. Well, let me just say that I am thoroughly opposed to cancel culture. I find it odious and pernicious, and that's not what we were doing, and that's not what we attempted to do. I mean, I did think Shooter was sort of the poster boy for a semi-literate, Philistine, buffoonish comic book editor at that time, you know, with his kind of simple-minded views of what constituted a story and what constituted acceptable comics. You know, a thoroughly mediocre editor who was imposing that mediocrity on his staff, and there were two aspects to this. One is whatever criticism we ran about him, and then the other side was journalistically the sheer number of people that were angry for whatever reason, whether they were angry for him his firing them, or letting them go, or in their opinion, ruining the books they were working on, and so forth. So he got a lot of heat, no doubt about it. But as I recall, there were an awful lot of people who defended him. And I haven't paid any attention to him in a long time, but as of a few years ago, he still seems to have a fan base. I mean, a few years ago,
he still has a fan base for
blog and
stuff he did. Yeah,
where he's writing his revisionist history, and he still seems to be sufficiently worshipped.
He has a voice, that's for sure, and he does write his own way of telling all of that.
His own view of history. So no, I think we probably just gave an alternative perspective on.
I gotcha, and that's good. That's good.
I have a question, since Alex brought up cancel culture, and then we'll go back. But I'm going to take us off the rails for a minute. Did you read this morning's Daily Beast story about all the sex aspects of things?
No, I heard about it, but I haven't read it yet.
And it goes through pretty.
It's a good. I hear it's a good summary of.
It's a very good summary.
Yeah.
It's very cohesive in everything, but it links all of that to a lot of the things that you were worried about and talking about when Comics Journal started. I mean, it talks about Kirby and his art. It talks about pay and how people are cheated, and that sexual discrimination and sexual harassment are born from those labor issues of the earlier times. That it's all part of the same mix. And I thought of you as I was preparing for this, and I read that. The question that I would come to from that is, when because I also know you signed the letter this week or last week about cancel culture and things. Didn't you sign that petition?
I would have loved to, but I didn't.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
I wasn't asked to. So.
Okay.
I would have.
With that is when these people are doing these things, the Warren Ellis kind of example, or whatever, where they have a long history of this. It's not to say that we should support canceling, but where do you stand on that in terms of, do we just not talk about it? Do we let them go forward with it? Or what do you do? Is cancel culture a problematic go-to, just like PC was years and years ago, where it becomes a way to distract from actually doing things that are important to accomplish? That would be my question.
Well, I mean, I think you have, okay, I think you have to distinguish between the artist and his work.
Right.
And I'm not intimately familiar with, I mean, I'm aware that Warren Ellis has been accused of a number of transgressions. And I'm going to read that piece. But, I mean, the question, I mean, it's difficult. I think what you shouldn't do is, you know, conflate the person with the work and cancel the work. I mean, I don't know if I don't know. I'm trying to pick some. You know, every one of these is so. Is unique to themselves, so it's hard to choose anyone. But I mean, I guess what I object to is, let me take an artist who I admire, who's Robert Crumb.
That's a good one.
Yeah, I mean, he's like the poster. He's the poster boy of cancel culture. You probably know that a room at a convention in Massachusetts, I think the convention is called Mice. They had rooms that were named after cartoonists, and they had the Eisner room, and maybe the McKay room, and they had the Crumb room, and they recently renamed the Crumb room because he's seen as a misogynist and a racist. Now, why the Eisner room is still there is something we should talk about. But
well, that might not be for, in the future.
Oh, do you know that, or?
Well, it's because there's these people saying with his with his character from the 40s, like
Ebony,
that there are people out there putting a petition to like get rid of his name and stuff like that.
Well, right. I mean, that wouldn't surprise me at all. So there's this backlash against Crumb, and you're probably aware that he was, his name, not even him, but his name was booed at the Ignatz Awards like 2 years ago.
Right.
Now, I don't think Crumb is above criticism, but I do think that this kind of mob mentality, this kind of reductionist mob mentality that fixates on one very narrow part of his comics career is intellectually and morally reductionist, and does not serve the purposes of viewing an artist in his entirety. I think that's and it's this kind of intellectual and moral reductionism that bothers me so much.
Yeah.
That it's focused on to the exclusion of everything else. And I'm not saying that can't be argued and it can't be debated.
We were talking about that at Comic Fest in San Diego recently. Mary Fleener and I were on a panel, and she brought up the Crumb example of exactly that, and people standing up and protesting and saying they were going to leave if he was there, and things that seem just outrageous and very dangerous. I think where it gets complicated is when you're not separating the art from the person, but where you have editorial, something like Shooter's misdeeds and handling of people while he was at Marvel. There isn't enough art to justify that. I mean, editorial policy is a problem that has to be corrected. And if it's not corrected, if it's not canceled because of how they're behaving in their job, which is what that is, I think that's a different thing. And the problem is it all gets conflated into one discussion sometimes.
Yeah. I'm not sure what part of Shooter you're talking about. I mean, he was.
Oh no, he was just an example. I mean, just how he behaved toward people. But I'm not.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was just. I mean, he was let go, right? He was eventually let go.
Yeah.
Yeah, 87.
Yeah, and I think that was just like a corporate policy that he caused so many problems, and I don't know. I mean, they were tired of him. The Trump syndrome. You just get tired of him, you want him out. And so that's something. That's something very different. I don't really have much of an opinion about that. I mean, I don't think Shooter was poorly treated by anybody, really. He swam with the sharks, and but someone like Crumb is a much more complex case. And I just, and it's the level and the tenor that I think, literally reduces the level of discourse
right
in the world. And it's what I just find so embarrassing. And
well, on a lighter note, how about that Amazing Heroes, Alex?
Yeah. So exactly. So now
speaking of embarrassing.
Okay. So again, yeah, because you're not into the superhero thing, but although the Comics Journal did provide the highbrow criticism that the industry probably needed, and I think to an extent you helped the comic industry grow up to some degree. I think that is true. But there was shortfalls in money. It's kind of like when Bill Gaines couldn't make money on the sci-fi, he was doing the horror stuff. You put out Amazing Heroes from 81 to 92. It was more of a superhero fanzine to make up for the cash deficit, and also kind of take maybe some of the fan base from the comics reader. What was your perspective on doing that? Were you kind of biting your tongue with every issue, or were you like, no, this is, some of the fans like it. It is what it is. I mean, what were you thinking with that?
Well, I mean, we published Amazing Heroes in order to bring in cash so we could support the rest of what we were doing. And so the question we asked ourselves, and this was in 1980, roughly 82 when it started, something like that.
Yeah, 81 is what I have. Yeah.
Could we publish a reasonably intelligent magazine about mainstream comics?
Right.
And one that would bring in some cash.
Right.
And Kim edited it for most of its run. And this is where we go back to Kim having a much more moderate view of comics. Mm-hmm. I mean, honestly, I never paid any attention to Amazing Heroes because it was entirely Kim's baby. He edited it, and I would occasionally read a piece, and it did run some good stuff. I mean, we would run interviews with Steve Root or Howard Chaykin or, a variety of other artists. They would certainly be on a better level than the Buyer's Guide and all the other, fan magazines that were out there. To me, it was just this thing that happened in another part of the office that I didn't pay a lot of attention to.
I see.
That
so you weren't that close
accepted.
enough to it to detest it.
No, I couldn't write. I was detesting too much, else.
As long as you're detesting something, yeah.
And it kind of it covered the whole mainstream arena. It covered it as well as it could be covered, as intelligently as it could be covered. But my feeling was that, I didn't even want that to exist. I didn't even want to, I wanted the less I knew about that, the better. And, it was sort of oxymoronic to me to cover that area of comics intelligently, even though we were doing that.
Yeah.
So, I was a little schizophrenic about it, but we did all kinds of things like that in order to keep our heads above water. I mean, we were always on the precipice of financial ruin.
Yeah, and that helped, to keep it going.
And Amazing Heroes was always, it turned into a biweekly,
mm-hmm.
and it was definitely a profit center. So it helped support us through hard times, and it helped support us finance projects that we wanted to do. I mean, it was a really good, steady moneymaker. And we never shied away. We never shied away from doing stuff like that, And in like what would have been 1981, 82, we published a couple of books called The X-Men Companion.
That's right.
Yeah, I have.
Which I had absolutely no interest in myself, but we figured, okay, they'll make money. Peter Sanderson edited them. We published them. I never really had a problem. Publishing stuff that made money that would allow us to publish work that we believed in and that would lose money.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I made that, I accepted that very early on.
Yeah.
I have a question, just real quick, as a person doing the not the Amazing Heroes, but the other stuff. As a divorce lawyer, I get used to people hating me to the point where it's part of the job.
Yeah.
It's almost a point of pride sometimes because that you did a good job because of that. I was reading reports by people that were talking positively about you, but talking about how much other people in the industry, Marvel and DC, detested you. And where if your name came up, it was somebody, I forgot who it was, but they were sharing a car with Bob Layton and with Jim Shooter. And the person defended you slightly. And that, what was it he said? He said something about their rectums tightened up so much that it was a reverse fart, was what it was. It was Barry Smith, I think.
That was Barry Windsor Smith, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And what was that like, and do you miss it? Because you're not hated as much these days.
No.
Because of age or whatever, they just, you don't have the same.
No.
Do you miss it?
Well, I do miss it in a way. I mean, in a way, I'm quite happy. I've achieved a Zen-like calm, and I don't have to wake up in the morning wondering, what backlash there's going to be.
And you're not a wayward teen anymore either.
Yeah, right. I'm a wayward, dotard. I do miss it. I mean, you have to understand, I didn't do that in order to be hated. It was just a logical consequence.
Sure.
To what I felt I had to do. And I always felt like I was hated by the right people. That was very important.
Right. If Kirby hated you, that'd be different. Yeah.
Well, if Kirby, that would be devastating, But really, you know, the people who hated me were the people that I had very little respect for. And so, you know, in that sense, it worked out very well. And you know, it was, I don't know, it was a very organic part of my life. You know, walking into a room and figuring out how many people in this room hate me.
So, you know, now Amazing Heroes coming to an end in 1992, kind of like the way you had kind of sucked some of the fan base and some of the from the comics reader. Was it like in the 90s there was so much of a glut of comics and magazines and yada yada? Wizard came out. Did that basically contribute to the end of Amazing Heroes?
Yeah, Wizard, and I think there was a magazine called Hero Magazine.
Okay.
Was it Hero? It was kind of a mini Wizard. It was like a kind of Wizard alternative. And I mean, they just they were just far stupider than Amazing Heroes, and they therefore captured that market.
Right. Okay.
And our, you know, our circulation was kind of going down. And it's not, when I say Amazing Heroes was profitable, you know, I don't mean immensely profitable, but by our meager standards, it was profitable.
Yes.
So if it went down, you know, if the sales went down a couple thousand, then it was, you know, marginal and no longer, you know, profitable. And they just ate away. I think it's when, you know, comics just became stupider and stupider. And the fact that the comics community, the comics fans, however you want to characterize it, how they could no longer support a magazine like Amazing Heroes, I think, is a great barometer for just how stupid the comics subculture became. You know, you had the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. You know, that was the beginning of the time when black and white comics became stupid.
Mm.
Then you had Image. Now, I don't know, I think Wizard came out before Image, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, I think of them as kind of together for some reason.
Yeah, I do too, but one had to be before the other. So
yeah.
I think it was, you know, Wizard, and then, but it was just this fucking locomotive of stupidity, and it couldn't be stopped. You know, you had. I mean, Image was sort of the the apex of idiocy and hypocrisy.
Do you feel like Image got better though, like now?
Well, probably, yeah. I mean, I know it transformed, of course, but honestly, I don't follow it.
Right.
Now it seems like instead of just doing, you know, brainless Marvel knockoff comics, they're doing middlebrow genre stuff. So
it's how Chaykin can work, because he certainly isn't going to get anything at Marvel or DC.
Well, didn't he just do something for DC? I mean, I think he did. Howard, you know, Howard claims
because Howard kind of has been a victim of this cancel mob as well.
Do you think so?
Yeah, his divided states of hysteria. Yeah, because we did a one-on-one interview with him, rather two-on-one, me and Jim did, and he goes into detail about that. Yeah, like he felt stabbed in the back by people. Yeah,
I'd like to know more about that. I mean, I remember when that happened. That only happened like a couple of years ago, right? 3 years.
Yeah.
And I remember sending him an email saying, "Why don't you tell everyone to go fuck off?" Right. And it seemed like he was treated shabbily by his publisher. Who was in it.
Yeah,
they did publish his Hey Kids. But they did publish his Hey Kids.
Yes.
Book. Well, because it was safe. But I mean, they didn't stand behind him when they needed to.
No, a lot of creators didn't either. I mean, he feels very stabbed in the back by people that he thought he was friends with as well.
Really? Yeah. Well, I can understand that. I mean, I was going to say, Howard. I think Howard thinks he's more uncommercial than he is. I think he still has a lot of commercial cachet. But
oh yeah, I love it. I love Howard's stuff. So one more question about the Comics Journal, then Jim's going to go talk about publishing and things. So the Comics Journal and you were involved in some lawsuits with various creators. Yeah. Harlan and Ellison and Fleischer, and give us some. First, were those scary for you at all? For one, and then two, just going through them. What can you share with us as far as surviving all that stuff?
Oh my! And do you hate lawyers?
I hate all lawyers except my own.
Yeah.
No, that's not true. I have a great lawyer. The lawyer who fought all those all that litigation for me is still our lawyer, and I still speak to him about legal issues. Jesus, it's such a different period. It's hard to explain to people who didn't live through that and didn't understand. So we were sued 3 times within the course of about, I think they all came within 18 months. And the first lawsuit was instigated in 1980. And then 2 more quickly followed. I think they thought, they might as well jump on here. And I think the aim of these lawsuits was to put us out of business. They wanted to bury us.
Was Fleischer the first one?
What's that?
Was Fleischer the first one?
Michael Fleischer was the first one. His lawsuit was based on an interview I did with Harlan Ellison, about which we could have a separate video cast.
Can we? Because I would like to go into great detail about, because you guys had a huge falling out over that, and then he sued you. And that's that, and then it was in letter pages for forever. I read everything about it through the Comics Journal.
Did you? Okay, yeah, it was. Yeah, knowing Ellison, you just have to watch your back at all times. And so I interviewed Ellison. Ellison's another guy. We should talk about people who I've met and whose friendship and professional relationship I treasure and love. But Ellison, I looked up to Ellison too, and did a long interview with him. And Michael Fleischer sued us based on that interview. Ellison made a couple of assertions that could be either considered fact or opinion, depending on how you looked at it, and said that Fleischer, based on his work, was crazy as a bedbug. And based on that, Fleischer sued us. He asserted that Ellison was saying that he was clinically insane and damaged his reputation as a result. And then a short while later, Alan Light sued me.
Right.
For an editorial I wrote about this. This was on the occasion of Alan Light selling the buyer's guide to that company in Michigan or wherever it was.
Yeah, Krause or something like that.
Yeah, Krause. And it was sort of my farewell editorial. And I accused him, I think I remember, let me see. I accused him of engendering spiritual squalor. And he sued me for that. And then Rich Buckler. You remember Rich Buckler?
Yeah.
With all the Kirby swipe stuff.
He sued us for asserting that he plagiarized Jack Kirby. And that was an article written by Ted White, who I had previously told you was our music columnist, and sounds fine. So we had 3 lawsuits going on at the same time. And when we were sued initially, I think I was 25. That would have been 1980. So I think it was 25 when Fleischer sued us. And we were just scraping by. We had absolutely no money. We could barely just survive. We could barely pay our rent. It was maybe 3 or 4 of us comprising the company. We weren't putting out Amazing Heroes. We weren't putting out, I think we were only putting out the Comics Journal in 1980. Yeah. So it was only probably 2 or 3 of us. working in this little office. And so he sued us for $2 million. And you asked me, I think you asked me if I was scared. And I don't remember being scared. I remember being exhilarated. And I remember thinking we should win this if we could ever, if we had the money to fight it. I remember being invigorated. Somehow we just thought we were going to somehow win this. Now, the problem is we had no money. So that's a big problem, as a divorce attorney must know.
Yes.
So we hired lawyers. Fleischer sued us first. This was a $2 million lawsuit. And I read about it. I think I read about it in Publishers Weekly before we were served. I read this notice that he sued us. And somebody brought it to my attention, because I'm sure I wasn't reading Publishers Weekly at the time, but somebody brought it to my attention and said, hey, Fleischer just said he filed suit against you. I said, what are you talking about? And, he sent me the article, and I call up Ellison, and Ellison, in his usual bravado says, don't worry about him. Fuck him. He's not going to sue us. And I said, well, it says he sued us. Yeah, don't worry about it. So I said, well, I'm a little concerned about this. And he said, don't worry about it. He said, I'm with you in this. If he sues you, I am with you 100%. And I was saying, well, I don't have any money, to fight a lawsuit. And he said, I'm with you. I'll help. So that reassured me. I felt good about that. So a few weeks later, we were served, and then Ellison was served. And I didn't know what to do, because we didn't even have a lawyer. So I called up Ellison, and I said, we've both been served. I said, what do we do? And he said, well, you got to find a lawyer. And I said, well, I don't know how to do that. And I don't know how to pay your lawyer. And, can you help us with this? You said you were going to be, behind us with this. And he said, and we're on the phone. I'm in Connecticut. He's in LA. And I am freaking out a little bit. And he said, look, man, I'm watching TV. I'm busy. I got to go. And that was it. And I'm on the phone, well, I thought this guy was behind us, and he's, he has money. He had just won $200,000 from a lawsuit of his own. So I figured, he could, when he said he could help us, he meant he could help me financially. So I didn't know what to do. So we hired lawyers. We found lawyers in New York. And these were high-powered lawyers. And so I employed them. I didn't know anything about lawyers or lawyering. And, and so there were some initial motions back and forth. And I remember about, 6 months to a year into the lawsuit. And again, keep in mind, I'm 25, maybe 26. And I go into my lawyer's office in New York. I go to visit him. And there's some motions back and forth already. And this guy was he was a slick operator. This guy was smart, and he'd been around. And of course, I wanted to win this, because there was a First Amendment issue at stake.
Yeah.
And he said, look, he got me into a conference room, one of those big conference rooms with a 20-foot table. And I sat there. And he said, look, he said, we can get this guy into deposition, and I can annihilate him. So, but he could still win. So I think you should cut a deal. And I kind of walked out. I was just kind of in a daze, because, here's my lawyer advising me to cut a deal. So that didn't sit well with me. So I don't want to drag this out too long, but I didn't know what to do. So I called the Playboy Foundation, which was Hugh Hefner's First Amendment organization. And I talked to a guy there named Bert Joseph, who was a First Amendment advocate, and he worked there. And I explained the situation. I said, I don't have any money. We have, we publish a magazine about comic books. And he said, what? I said, yeah, comic books. He said, all right. And he said, well, he said, here's the name of a lawyer, First Amendment attorney in New York. Call him. I know him. He's a friend of mine. And he might take you on. And that lawyer's name was Ken Norwick. And I went into Ken's office, laid the whole situation out for him, showed him the magazine, and he looked at it, and he said, we could win this. I'll do it. I'll take it on. And, then we had to figure out how to pay him. But he was a little loose about that. He said, you got to pay me, but, you can, we can figure it out. So he took us on, and we fought that lawsuit for 7 years.
Wow. Until
we finally, in a jury trial in the Southern District Court of New York, won. But it was a brutal fight. I mean, it was 7 years of our lives. It was tremendous amounts of depositions. Many people in the comics industry were subpoenaed. Many people were deposed. We were subpoenaing people left and right. It just went on and on and on. The depositions lasted for weeks.
Yeah.
The jury trial was 4 weeks long. It was just an amazing brawl.
7 years is an incredible amount of time to be caught up emotionally in that.
Yeah. Well, thank God we were young, and it divided the comics industry. Here's what's possibly more interesting is that it divided the comics industry. It divided them into two camps. One was ours, and one was by default Fleischer's. And the reason people were supporting Fleischer, Fleischer really wasn't part of the comics community. I mean, nobody really knew him very well. He didn't hang out with other comics creators. He wasn't, particularly liked. He wasn't, I don't think, disliked, but I mean, he just wasn't part of that community. But people wanted to see us destroyed. And so as a result, they supported him.
So they weren't on his side as much as they were not on your side.
Right. They weren't on his side per se. They just hated us so much that he was a convenient bludgeon.
But you had to fight it because the impact, if you hadn't, would be how do you do criticism of anybody's work if you can't, if you have to worry about getting sued for saying something derogatory about that.
Yeah, well, I felt strongly about that. I mean, first of all, of course, I mean, we go out of business. I mean, there would be no comics journal.
But what happened to Harlan? Because he was named in it too. Was he?
Well, he was there throughout most of the suit. I mean, and our falling out was due to certain machinations throughout the lawsuit. He was my co-defendant.
Right.
But he was so utterly fucking treacherous that I had this one guy suing me, and I had a co-defendant who would stick a knife in my back at the nearest opportunity. So I had to watch both of them.
He eventually sued you himself, didn't he, over something?
Yeah, that was a long time. That was in 2006, I think. And that was about something else entirely. Yeah. Yeah. And that's a whole other story.
Well, we could do this I could do this all day because I have all these follow-up questions. In the Comics Journal, one of the things I respect most about it has been not just your lawsuits, but other important lawsuits you have covered in a very smart way that I could appreciate as a lawyer. Your depositions that you include, the transcripts, things like that, that you do that nobody else does. Yeah. And I think it's very important. to do. I want to move on to the publishing part, and rather than the Comics Journal part. Although I wish we had more time to do both, and maybe we can do another interview.
We could bore your reader, your viewership into a blind stupor.
Well, 2 points on Comics Journal, and then I'll move 3 actually. Honk.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about Honk. I have all the issues of Honk.
Yeah.
And I really enjoy that. But what made you do that, and why was it not successful?
Well, I can't tell you why. I mean, all I can do is tell you not enough people bought it. I don't know. I mean,
I bought it.
I mean, it was an oddball humor magazine, published. Let me see. Hold on. That would be 85 to 88, something like that. 86 to 80. Yeah, something like that. I mean, it was just an oddball magazine that very few people at that time are going to buy. And success or failure depended on like 1,000 people. I mean, if 1,000 more people bought it, it would have continued. And I don't remember, you'd have to look in you don't have a copy handy, I guess. Tom Mason, who worked in our art department, might have started the magazine. And if that's the case, I think he edited it. Either he started it and edited it from the beginning, or he took it over at some point. But I think he just came to me, and he was a designer, and he worked in the art department. And I think he just came to me and said, I'd like to put this magazine together, and it'll include this and this and this, and these kinds of artists, and this is the direction, and what about it? And sounded good to me.
I say it partly as a segue to we're going to talk about publishing, because in that were things in the issue that I believe it was the one that had the World's Toughest Milkman on the cover, and an interview there. It had it was a European comic, and the name is escaping me of him, but it was about the giraffe, and it was playing with panels. Do you know the one I'm talking about?
Is this something we published?
Yes, this was in Honk, and it was entitled The Giraffe, and it was like a 9-panel grid, but the character kept moving around through the 9 panels, and it's a famous European artist, but there were things like that were quirky, and I'll let you know who it is. I'm just blanking.
Yeah. But
you guys were introducing material that nobody saw anywhere else with that.
Could that have been Frank Kahn? Andre Frank Kahn?
Yes, it totally was. And there I have a book. You can't see my books, unfortunately.
No, I can't see your books.
But you did publish this recently.
Yeah, I can kind of see it a little bit.
Die Laughing.
But they do exist. The books do actually exist.
It's like a Steranko effect.
Yes. But I just want to say, you were interested in publishing, and I know Kim Thompson was a lead in a lot of this, but that's something I want to talk about in that part. Before I leave Comics Journal, a couple of things. What was it like to actually get? We talked about people that liked you, or that got mad at you or whatever. What was it like to get yelled at by Jules Feiffer over your Eisner comments?
Well, it was intimidating.
That's what I'm a huge fan of Feiffer, and
me too.
It would make me cry if I got yelled at by him.
Yeah. It was intimidating.
And maybe we should explain to the listeners what I'm talking about. You had written something about Eisner that called into question his actual ability. Like you were critical of his actual art, which a lot of people stay away from to some degree.
Right.
And Feiffer wrote to you, or did he call you?
No, this was in an interview I did with Jules.
Okay.
And I wrote a review of 3 books by Eisner, and and this was his post-Spirit graphic novel phase. You know, when he started doing A Contract with God in 78, I think it was.
The Building, I think, was one of the...
The Building was one, but then he did a succession of graphic novels after that. And I think my review appeared in 89. And it was a review of a couple of his books, including his autobiographical book called The Dreamer.
Right. Which other people are critical of as well.
Which was really, truly a miserable book. I mean, just fundamentally dishonest. And I wrote as much. And so a few years later, maybe only a year or two later, I'm interviewing Jules, who is one of my heroes. Of course, I had seen Carnal Knowledge before I had seen Feiffer's cartoons. So anyway, this was a big opportunity for me, I thought. I mean, interviewing Jules. And Jules was, he was exactly the kind of cartoonist I wanted to get in the Comics Journal. You know, I wanted to get outside of comic books, and I wanted to get outside of comic strips. I wanted to do editorial cartoonists, and I wanted to do uncategorizable cartoonists like Jules or Ralph Steadman. So, that was important to me. So I was in Jules' studio, and we were talking, and I forget how it came up. It seems like he must have brought it up, because I don't think I would have brought it up. But he told me that he thought I was wrong. My assessment of Eisner was wrong. And I defended myself. But I mean, it was a forceful attack on the review. And yeah, and I mean, he attacked and I defended myself, but I don't think I expected that. But he goes back a long way with Eisner.
Way to the beginnings, yes.
And yeah, I mean, Eisner was the guy who hired him when he was 14 years old or something, and so he has a great sentimental attachment to Eisner, and I think that more than anything else is why he felt the need to defend Eisner.
One other question, just to go back to the lawsuits and things. As a journalist, was it difficult for you, for the Comics Journal to be covering the Comics Journal? Like, how do you as a journalist write about something when you're in the middle of it, where you're part of the story?
Well, I don't remember who wrote the news pieces about the journal's own lawsuits. I don't know if we got anyone outside the journal to do it. It never bothered me. I mean, the whole conflict of interest between us publishing books and the Comics Journal reviewing books never bothered me one whit. And I always felt that I had the ability to stand outside of both the Comics Journal and our book publishing, and to be objective about that. And I think that's proven. If any academic has taken this on and has done a survey of all the books of ours that we've reviewed, I think they'll find that that we do not favor our books. So I never had a problem with that. I mean, if we got a negative review in on a book that I loved, and we published a negative review of Love and Rockets very early on, because I wrote a very positive review of it before we started publishing it, and then we started publishing it, and about a year in, we ran a very negative review of Love and Rockets, for example, and and I also had this, in retrospect, naive view that the artists we published were so good and so sort of incontestably good that they wouldn't care if we ran a negative review of their work. Now, I think in retrospect that was not true, but I felt compelled to do that. Like if we got a review in unsolicited, and if it was a negative review of one of our books, and I thought it was intellectually defensible, not just a hatchet job, I would run it. And it was a difficult place to be.
So tell us about like reprinting, like newspaper comic strips, like the like Prince Valiant and whatnot. So how do you make something like that profitable? Because sometimes it isn't.
Yeah, well, your premise is false. You don't make it profitable.
There you go.
Peanuts.
No,
You made money on peanuts.
Some of it is and some of it isn't. Yeah, absolutely. Well, okay, here's the thing. I mean, when we started publishing comics in 1981, our idea was just, Kim's and my idea was just to publish great cartooning. And it didn't matter if it was European cartooning or old newspaper strips or contemporary work like Love and Rockets. To us, it was just all good cartooning.
Yeah.
So we didn't make a hard distinction between, this is our classics line and this is this line and this line. To us, it was just all great cartooning, and that's all we wanted to publish. And so Rick Marshall came on the scene in like 1980 or 81, and he proposed Nemo to us, the magazine about comics,
right?
About newspaper strips, which we published 31 issues of,
mm-hmm.
in which he edited. An amazing magazine.
Yeah, and that was influential. There's a lot of historians in the Facebook group that they were influenced by those.
Yeah, it's a tremendous monument, to Rick's knowledge and passion. And so Rick brought a few books to us. We published a Red Berry book. I don't know why Rick brought Red Berry to us. Maybe he was in public domain or something, but we published a Red Berry book. We published Popeye. I'm not sure if Popeye was Rick's idea or was it Bill Blackbeard's idea. I'm not sure. We started publishing Popeye in like 1982. My dates might be off by a year or so. And we started publishing Prince Valiant around 82. Sometimes, and the reason we published all of these is just because we loved great cartooning. We just wanted to publish good cartooning. It didn't matter where it came from, or what it was. So to us, it was just all a part of the whole.
Now, as far as making up for stuff that is losing money, you talked about doing Amazing Heroes in the 80s, and we briefly mentioned it before, but in the 90s then, as Amazing Heroes goes to the wayside, you guys start publishing Eros, the pornographic comics, to bring in some money. Does that basically then help fund, and did it help fund as effectively as Amazing Hero did in the 80s, Eros in the 90s, to fund the other publishing ventures?
It was far more effective than Amazing Heroes.
Oh wow!
We were losing money. There were we went through a period of I would say almost 2 years where we were just losing ground, starting around 89, and I could see us losing ground, and I just couldn't think of anything to do about it. And neither Kim nor I were good at coming up with money-making schemes. We just weren't good at it. We were good at kind of guerrilla publishing what we wanted to publish, but we weren't good at just coming up with something that would make a lot of money.
Yeah.
And if you look at most publishers, they always have these tentpole projects that make a lot of money. So we were just backsliding, for a year and a half, 2 years. And, we didn't know what to do about it. We saw it was happening, and we couldn't figure it out. So unbelievably, one day I just came up with this brilliant idea that sex sells. Just dawned on me.
Mm-hmm. Right. Out of the blue.
So I thought, well, shit, we published erotic comics, maybe, there was Omaha the Cat Dancer, that did well. God, I don't know, was Cherry around then? I mean, there were a few erotic comics.
Right.
I think Chaykin had done Black Kiss by then.
Right, yeah.
So there were like, a little sprinkling erotic comics. And coincidentally, they all sold well. And it really took me a while to put two and two together. Like maybe we should do this.
Martin Goodman would have jumped all over that a lot sooner. Yeah.
Well, I'm surprised Al Goldstein didn't. So, I talked to Kim about it, and we agonized over this decision. It's like, well, should we do this? It's porn. And I would talk to other people about it. And everyone we talked to said, if you have to do it, do it. If that's what to do it. I remember talking to Robert Crumb about it. And I said, well, we're struggling with this. We might do this. And I'm not sure. I'm not sure I feel good about this. And he said, Jesus, get over it. Just do it. I mean, he was just so like, what are you complaining about? What are you whining
I don't see how he would say no to that anyway.
Right. I mean, even though, what he did wasn't porn, but it was pornographic.
Right. Would you say they're similar to Tijuana Bibles? What you guys did? I guess not.
Mostly not. No.
Yeah.
No. I mean, what we did, it ran the gamut. I mean, if you haven't studied Eros, it just ran the gamut.
Yeah. I used to see those at Virgin Megastore when I was in high school, and I didn't buy any because my mom would get mad at me. But I flipped through it. I didn't put it down I was flipping through them.
Well, depending on what you looked at, I mean, it could be just extraordinary. If it was something like by Frank Thorne,
right,
or Francisco Solano Lopez, it could be really superb work. Or it could just be weird, brainless, sex stuff.
Yeah, like orgies and stuff. I remember thinking, I didn't know penises could have this many veins.
Right. Or this person had this many penises. But we started it. We sent out a call. We sent out, I don't know, what did we do? There weren't emails back then. So we sent out letters to like cartoonists saying, we're starting an erotic line of comics. And if you have any ideas, and if you ever wanted to do one, let us know. Well, we were inundated. Apparently, there were all these repressed cartoonists out there. And we were inundated with submissions. So Frank Thorne was in the original wave.
Yeah.
And, we published several erotic comics. I think it was 1991. And I am not exaggerating. In 9 months, we had dug ourselves out of the hole. 9 months of publishing Eros comics.
And that's like direct market to stores and stuff, right?
It was to comic stores, who many of whom created, an erotic section that was composed mostly of our books. And we did a huge mail order business too. So, then we just, we went all in, we just sort of, we had an Eros editor, and that became this division. As far as I was concerned, it was like it was like Amazing Heroes. It was like this division. I didn't have to pay too much attention to it. We had an Eros editor, and we published, like just a mountain of filth. I mean, it was just an unbelievable tsunami of erotic stuff, and some of it was great, and some of it was, lousy, and we just cranked it out, and that supported, all of the, the grossly uncommercial alternative work that we wanted to publish during that period.
Right. Yeah. And you guys are reprinting or have reprinted Barks, EC, foreign material, like Craypacks and whatnot. So it's nice to have something that can fund that sort of artistic, because you were introducing a whole generation of Americans to this stuff, to the good stuff. I mean, and maybe the bad
erotica.
Stuff too.
Yeah, we were introducing a whole generation of Americans to pornography too.
Is that Is that why the Washington newspaper gave you the Genius Award?
For which one?
One of them announced you were the genius of the moment, or the genius.
Yeah, I got the Genius Award for you. I mean, for which one? Pornography or the
for figuring out the sex cells.
Yeah, that's it.
But you applied it in an effective way to survive, and that's admirable.
We did.
I like that.
It's one of the few things we actually did. I mean, you know, you could say Amazing Heroes was another one, and you know, a scattering of things once in a while. But that was, you know, that was a huge thing. And the other thing you'll learn if you become a pornographer, every other phrase out of your mouth is a double entendre, whether you intend to be.
So your mind's in the gutter all the time.
You can't go 3 sentences without saying something. I mean, when we were at the height, this was pre-digital. We had like piles of original art from, you know, Frank Thorne and you know, all these artists. I mean, it was amazing. You know, Robert Crumb. Yeah, I mean, and we did seek out good work. You know, I mean, we obviously had to publish a certain amount of this stuff to stay afloat, but we really did seek out good work. You know, we sought out gay erotica, you know, lesbian erotica, you know, good artists. Gilbert Hernandez did a book that was fantastic. So we tried our best. But yeah, we were just cranking it out.
Right. But I mean, I wouldn't call you a pornographer, because it's not like you actually got women in a studio and making them do stuff, right? That's a different thing.
No, I use that term ironically, you know.
But it's a fun irony.
Yeah. Right. No, it took me a while, but you know, I got a kick out of it. Yeah, it was all drawn.
Yeah.
No one was exploited in the making of this.
Right. That's the thing. That's the key difference.
Comics.
Yeah.
On the subject of comic strip reprints, I got a couple of questions. I brought up Peanuts, and I know that was a very profitable one that you actually published the entire run, correct? Yes. I mean, you. There are others where I don't know. Did you run out of steam with the Dennis the Menace books? I mean, there's only because I was buying every one of those.
I didn't. I think the readers ran out of steam.
I bought them all, but sales were going down, and that was why the decision was made.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I think we published 5 or 6 volumes, and it really dropped like a stone. I mean, the first volume sold really well, and then you always experience a drop in series, but then you hope it plateaus and just maintains a decent sales level. And Dennis and Menace just kept dropping. And I think after the 3rd volume, most of the world had come to the conclusion that they had enough of Dennis the Menace. And I thought it was very unfortunate, because I mean, I love that stuff, and I thought Ketchum's work was just extraordinary. The drawing is beautiful.
His line work is just beyond. It's so good.
It's stunning. I mean, everything about him. You know, his gesture, the ink line, and you know, even the gags were good.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know, maybe they got worse later on. I'm not sure about that, but I mean, it wasn't just a dopey, you know, panel. It was, the gags were funny and they were witty.
Does this mean I may not find out how Barnaby ultimately ends?
It will not mean that. Barnaby allows. I think the vast volume of Barnaby is going to the printer.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah,
I've really enjoyed that as
well. Another masterpiece. Crockett Johnson's, I think the best thing Crockett Johnson ever did.
Yeah. And what about, is Pogo selling well? Is that going to...
Pogo sells reasonably well. Yeah. And we'll continue that for the duration. Yeah.
Okay. That's good. So Dennis and Menace was almost an outlier in terms of that.
It was. Yeah. I mean, I can't think of another, well, I mean, Roy Crane, can't sell Roy Crane.
Which shocks me, because I love Roy Crane stuff.
Yeah, Roy Crane, he's a brilliant cartoonist, but my God, we can't sell him.
So do these books stay in print, and why do some go out of print? And I'm specifically talking about the one of the Popeye volumes. There's the one that I can't get unless you can get it to me.
You know, I think of our Popeye series, I think there are 8 volumes, and I think 7 are out of print.
Oh, now they are? I was victim only of 1 going out of print. I have
no, I just checked that recently. As a matter
but Jim,
of fact,
you're talking about the Jeep, the one with the Jeep in it.
Yeah.
No, I think there might be more than that out of print. There might be a few copies in our warehouse of a few volumes, but I looked at the inventory, and they're almost all out of print. There's only 1 we have any significant inventory on. And the problem is you can't reprint those. They're too expensive to reprint.
And that would be my segue to something I've wanted to ask you since we interviewed Trina Robbins and we were talking about Nell Brinkley. What is the reason that a book like that I think is so important? And I know there's a new Flapper book coming out, but the Nell Brinkley book, I bought probably 5 copies of it and gave it to people for holidays and things. Every niece, every girl that I knew, a young woman, I wanted her to read that. Why isn't that still in print? Is it just too expensive?
Well, look, the only reason a book isn't in print is because the publisher doesn't think he can sell enough copies to warrant the reprint. And now you're getting into a little bit of minutia here where a reprint always costs more to print than the original printing.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, because you're going to be printing fewer copies.
I see.
Okay, if you can print 5,000 copies of a book, initially, when you reprint it, you're going to be printing 2. And that's because when you print a book, initially, you have a big bump in sales. The minute it comes out, it's going to sell a lot. And then it's going to, then it's going to become a backlist, and it's going to sell more slowly over time. Well, when you reprint a book, you start off selling it slowly. You do not have that initial sale. So you have to be able to warrant the cost of a reprint by the sales over the course of 12 to 18 months. And if you can't do that, you can't afford to reprint that book. That's really the only reason a book isn't reprinted.
With all of the renaissance in printing of the important comic strips, is there something out there that you think that you haven't gotten or no one has printed that you think needs to be done, or have we pretty much completed the set?
You know, I'm not sure. I think about this, of course, because I'm always interested in, one of the great joys of my job is to find new work, even if that's old work. And I'm not sure, if there's much in the way of entire strips that need to be reprinted at this point. I think there might be some strips that, that you could put in an omnibus that ought to be available, but that aren't of the first tier. They're sort of like second or third tier strips, but they still display enough craft or enough wit or ingenuity or something that they ought to be available to readers who want to see them. I mean, one thing I think is that there are a number of artists out there whose work should be reprinted. Tommy Unger, for example, who I interviewed a couple of years ago. And
I have that issue. I have his big book. I read his books to my kid, my 7-year-old.
Oh, do you?
All the time. I love those books.
Great.
From the early ones to Fog Island, everything in between.
Fog Island is terrific. But we're reprinting his satirical books, which are a particular favorite of mine. So we just published his Underground sketchbook, and we have a book of his called The Party it's going to press. I think it just went to press. So we're getting his satirical books back into print.
Oh, that's fantastic.
There are other artists like Robert Osborne. We just published Art Young. We just published 2 books.
Oh, I have that. That's a great book. You guys did a great job on that. That's a fantastic book.
Are you talking about Inferno?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I'm talking about the other one that came out.
The career.
I've ordered Inferno. I haven't gotten that yet.
Yeah. So I think there are a lot of artists whose work should be put back into print, but it's tough because there's only a limited number of people like you. So.
That's true, and I can attest to that.
Yeah, I bet you can.
Thanks, Alex. So let's talk about the material that you the people that you published over the years that have made tremendous impact on us. If you had to say, Love and Rockets obviously is one of the most important books and creators that you published. Who else would you say? Would it be Neat Stuff? Would it be Naughty Bits? Would it be Meat Cake, Jim, up to Hip Hop Family Tree? There's so many things. What are the things you're most proud of? Frank, what are the things that you're most proud of?
Oh man, I hate this because I'm going to forget so many people, which I don't want to do. You mentioned Love and Rockets. I had no idea when we started publishing Love and Rockets that Jaime and Gilbert would become two of the greatest cartoonists alive. I was excited about their work, but I consider Love and Rockets our flagship publication.
Who knew it was going to grow? I mean, and I love the early stuff, but boy, they just went like a rocket off into other places.
They both did, Yeah. And I remember being so exhilarated by their work. That was the kind of work that I was envisioning as to what comics could be, and they actually evolved into that kind of work too. I saw it in their the earliest work, but then they just grew into my own conception of what comics could be, which is a medium that directs its expressive possibilities toward the human condition, toward all of the things that are that are most important to us in our lives. That's what they do. After when we published Gilbert and Jaime, shortly after that we published Pete Baggs' Neat Stuff, and then Pete grew into one of the great satirical artists, and then shortly after that Dan Clowes. And, Dan started off with Lloyd Llewellyn.
Yeah.
And I like, I don't know, I saw such an absolute control over the medium and what he was trying to Lloyd isn't great. Dan went on to do great work. But what I saw in Lloyd Llewellyn was just that he knew what he wanted to communicate, and he knew what he wanted to convey, and he did it perfectly. But I had no idea he could do anything more than that. And then he went on to deepen and broaden his range. Joe Sacco.
Oh yeah, that's right. I didn't mention him, and I should have.
Yeah, Joe worked in our office. He wrote news for the Comics Journal. He was a staff writer for the Comics Journal in 1985, I think. And he would show us his comics every once in a while, me and Kim. And they were okay. We started publishing Yahoo, his anthology comic, around 87, something like that, 86, 87. And they were short stories and autobiographical stories. And he was really just kind of finding his voice. And then, of course, he went to Israel and went to and Palestine and started drawing Palestine. When did that start? 88, 89, something like that. And then he found what he was meant to do, which was comics journalism, and he virtually invented that category. Joe's been a good pal since then. Kim is the one who discovered Chris Ware. He showed me his work in the Chicago Reader. It would have been around 1990, maybe. And I had read Chris's story in Raw before, but I didn't actually put the two together. You know, I mean, Chris did this kind of superhero-y, you know, I mean, it was a satirical take on superheroes. But then Kim showed me the work in the Chicago Reader, and I remember thinking, well, you know, this is pretty interesting. But it was Kim who really brought him in and contacted Chris and arranged for Chris to do books for us. I think we published, I don't know, 6 or 7 Acme novelty libraries before Chris went off on his own.
Yeah.
You brought up, there's so many. I mean, Carol Tyler, we've been publishing, you know, for a long time, and she's extraordinary. You know, I think we published Aileen Kaminsky Crumb in the late 80s. We published a collection of her work. I'm proud of the fact that we published a lot of women cartoonists in the 1980s when there were, you know, I mean, there were so few women. Did you do Julie Doucet's stuff? No, we didn't.
No, that'd be drawn in quarterly.
B&Q did Julie, I think, starting around 1990 or 91. Yeah,
that's right.
But God, you know, there were it's hard to believe, and you know, and no, people in their 20s just can't even conceive of this, but there were so few women in comics in the 1980s.
You did La Perdita, right?
Yeah, sure. Jessica Abel's work. Yes.
Jessica Abel's work. Yeah, I remember that. That was great.
We published that, and I think we published 2 books by Jessica before that as well.
You brought up Raw, and I wanted to ask you that. What's the difference in your publishing philosophy or what you're trying to put out there compared to what Spiegelman was doing? Or is it, because it seems like you got some crossover like Gary Panter.
Sure.
But were you approaching a different notion of audience or a different kind?
Well, I mean, if Art had come to us and said, I want you to publish Raw, we would have published it in a New York Minute.
Right.
Because it was certainly, you know, the kind of work that we thought was inspirational. But, you know, but Art and Francoise, who co-edited it, you know, they had their own very distinct sensibility, which might be more experimental and less narrative driven than mine and Kim's was, I think. I mean, which is kind of paradoxical because Mao's is very narrative driven. I mean, it's, but there was a lot of work in Raw. I mean, it ranged. I mean, there were narratives. Kim Deitch was in there. Charles Burns was in there. But there was work where the form took center stage and was possibly more important than the actual narrative. And sure. I think Art probably had a greater and more intense interest in form than we did.
Oh, that's interesting.
I mean, we did, you know, we cared about the form, and I think we have published some more experimental work, but he really sought it out. So I think if there's any distinction, you know, distinction between us, it's probably his emphasis on form.
I asked you in relation to comic strips if there was other things you thought needed to be published or what, and there's not the obvious missing greatness, but Fantagraphics has started printing more and more European comics and foreign material. What are the things out there that are your targets that you want to really, really cover besides the Creepax books, which have been great? What else are you looking for?
Well, you mean, well, I don't think I can cite specific artists we're looking for. I mean, a lot of great cartoonists, you know, have already been covered, like Hugo Pratt. I mean, I would, you know, publish him in a minute, but I think somebody's publishing him, IDW or Dark Horse.
And Jacques Tardi, you also have done his.
Yeah. I mean, Jacques Tardi was Kim's author.
Right.
Kim said once that he thought Tardi was the greatest cartoonist in the world. I remember replying that, not as long as Crumb is around, but we would have aesthetic.
Oh, that's great. That was your conversation?
Yeah. And I love Tardi. I mean, I want to make that clear. But that's how big an admirer Kim was of Tardi. So Kim started publishing Tardi, and we're continuing doing that. And Tardi has a lot more work. We have two books in house right now by Tardi, and he's certainly one of the great European cartoonists. Krapax was someone I was very happy to publish. I was familiar with his work from many, many years ago. But his work had been so, Catalan, I think it was, published a book of his called Harlan, The Man in Harlem. And that was a fantastic book. No erotica whatsoever. It was just a drama about, about a situation in Harlem. And so I was a big Krapax fan, but most of the big, historic European cartoonists, I think, have been published here or are being published here. And so I'm sorry.
I was going to say not European, but I want to see Breccia get a full publishing of everything.
Oh yeah, well he is. Yeah, we're publishing all of his work.
Right, and he's probably my favorite.
Well, he is a genius. Stylistically, he's breathtaking because he doesn't have one style; he has multiple styles. I mean, he is so. Words fail me. I mean, he's so amazing. I mean, and every single book he does is so stylistically distinctive. He is masterful. The works in themselves, each individual work is extraordinary. We published Paramus, and we published Mort Cinder, and we have Eternaut 1969 that's at the printer.
Can't wait for that.
Yeah.
Alex gave me the German copy translation, so I actually have the work, but not.
You do, yeah.
Yeah, I like it. I mean, I like both Eternauts, but although there's some stuff after, but that 69, I mean, all those it's not as long as the first one, but it's beautiful panels. Yeah. And I actually had to type it in German to English in Google just to kind of get what was going on, but it was good.
Well, soon you won't.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I mean, Brescia's an artist that, we published Paramus in the 80s. Kim spearheaded that. And we published 4 issues of Paramus. I think they were 48-page magazines. And here's a funny little story. So I wanted to publish the whole book, Paramus. And I'd read our own 4-issue series of Paramus when we published it in the 80s. And so anyway, we got the license to publish all of Alberto Brescia's work. So Paramus was on the list. So I thought, okay, good. We'll publish Paramus. It's already translated. Kim translated it when we published it in the 80s. And what he translated was about 180 pages. And so I'm digging in and doing my Brescia research, and I discover that that's only 1/3 of the book.
Oh.
And I never knew that. I assumed Kim knew that, but never told me. But, and I don't know why we didn't publish the rest of it. Maybe it wasn't selling that well, but Kim had his own reasons. And but I thought it was the whole book, and it wasn't the whole book. So we had, of course, to retranslate the entire book. So we did not have the head start I thought we did. But I'm excited about Brescia. But I'm not sure there's anyone else of his comparable stature that's out there. I'd love people to drop me a line and let me know. And right now we're looking at more contemporary work. I mean, we publish the cartoonist Manuel Fior. We published Jippy. There are a lot of European cartoonists that we're publishing, a couple South American cartoonists, and of course a very slim but selective manga line.
Oh, is it Native? Was it what's the one? Wandering Sun.
Wandering Sun, yes.
I
Yeah.
have those. I have those. I like those quite a bit. They're very good.
8 volumes, yes.
Yes.
Um,
Well, I could do this all day, but
I want to ask some money questions since I'm relegated as the porn money person right now, but I want to continue the theme a little. So in 1977, so I read a couple like landmarks as far as like Fantagraphics was about to fall apart, and then money came in to basically save the company. And so in 77, Kim Thompson came in using his inheritance to keep the money afloat. In 2003, Fantagraphics almost went out of business. A former employee said it was financially disorganized, and then fans contributed with a lot of orders to get it back up into the positives. Then Kim Thompson died in 2013. There was voided Fantagraphics, and Kickstarter brought in $150,000 into the company. First, are these correct statements? And then second, is that just kind of always a concern? And is this a repeating thing that you just always have to do, and that fans have supported you? You know, what's your take on all that?
well, I think those are more or less correct. I mean, I'd love to add some nuance, but you missed about 24 other crises.
Right, there's a lot. Yes.
It's always been difficult. It got a lot easier when we started publishing Peanuts, because Peanuts was a regularly published book, and that helped us. That helped us a lot. I mean, prior to that, it was just economically debilitating.
Yes.
We were all always under the gun. We would go for a year or maybe 2 years without suffering any financial problems, but then we would always hit a wall, and we always had to figure out something to do to make enough money to keep going. The ones you mentioned were probably just the most acute financial crises.
Yeah, sudden, and then there
were
numerous
financial problems. And you have to understand that, I mean, neither Kim nor I were business people. We didn't have a clue about business. It was all by the seat of our pants. And we had to learn how to do this. I had to learn how to read a P&L statement. I had to learn cash flow. And it was all intuitive. And we never had any master plan. And I think Kim and I were both temperamentally unsuited for to be in a position of business, but it was the only way we could fulfill what we wanted to do. We wanted, like, originally, I mean, Kim came on after the Comics Journal started, but he was fully on board, and we wanted to create this magazine of criticism and serious journalism, and the only way we could do it is by creating it ourselves, and that meant creating a business.
Are you more of a business person now than you were?
Yeah. I mean, if nothing else, by dint of the fact that I've done it for so long, and I can navigate these. I can just navigate these difficulties. But yeah.
Yeah. So just out of necessity, you've had to kind of become more the business person that you used to be.
Yeah, it's by necessity. I don't love it.
Right.
Some people love business, and I'm not one of those.
So then, last question from me that I have is, so first, I've talked to other people who publish magazines with interviews, and I've heard of stories of that they would, let's say, tape, because they didn't have enough tapes, they would tape over someone else's interview with another person's interview just so they can get the transcript in. Do you actually have every audio tape interview that you've done, or most of them?
Yeah, we have most of them.
And
there might have been a few that have been lost. But we have hundreds and hundreds of tapes.
What do you plan on doing with all those?
Well, we're digitizing them now.
Okay, so you are doing that.
But it's a long process and it's a lot of labor, and we have limited resources. So it's a very slow process, and it stops and starts and stops and starts. We're just keeping them. I mean, we're keeping them safe, and we are digitizing them. Yeah.
Have any like documentary people ever approached you about using any of that footage for their own kind of for their own means?
Yeah. Yeah, someone who's doing a documentary on Charles Schultz, as a matter of fact, just now has my interview with Sparky, is going through it to see if they want to use anything. Yeah,
I see. So then you're not necessarily against that, against
no.
those.
Oh no, not at all, not at all. No, I don't know, I'd like these to be available at some point, or I don't know how, or through what mechanism, but.
So is it all cassette tape then?
Well, it is as of a few years ago.
Okay.
Yeah. Let me see. Tommy Unger is the first artist I interviewed digitally.
Okay, yeah. As far as new interviews are digital, yeah, sure.
Every previous interview is on cassette tape.
Yeah, cassette tape, yeah, which is hard to digitize. And they probably don't sound so good now, right?
Well, trying to think if I remember. They don't sound bad. I mean, they sound okay.
I see.
I mean, I would often interview people either, in their office or in their studio, so the tape recorder would be right there, or over the phone, which is even better, because I would have a mechanism, like some old-fashioned mechanism where I plug it directly into the phone. And the sound quality really isn't bad.
Do you charge a fee for people using them, or is it just kind of depending on the project?
Well, it does depend on the project. I mean, if I play it by ear. I mean, if the documentary had some money behind it, I would charge something. And if it was just some poor schlub in his garage putting something together, I wouldn't. I thought you were going to ask me if I actually taped accidentally over interviews.
Well, yeah. Well, that's why I was asking if you actually had, but it sounds like you didn't do that too often.
Yeah, I've actually done this while interviewing the person.
Oh, like you just taped over something you just recorded?
I interviewed Art Spiegelman once in his studio, and you flip over a cassette tape.
Yeah.
Well, I flipped it over twice.
Oh no!
I was so fucking frustrated and pissed off. And we were going. We were like, we had a head of steam. And when Art and I get talking, we were just talking. And I flipped it over, flipped it over again. And then about 10 minutes into it, something triggers in my brain. And I go, oh shit, I think
So this was during the interview when you realized?
During the interview. I mean, it was more than 10 minutes. It was like maybe 20 or 30 minutes into it. And I realized it. And I said, oh, fuck, I can't believe I did this. And so we actually tried to reconstruct what we talked about in that.
That's nice. That's nice of him to play ball like that.
I've had bigger nightmares, though. I've had, I've interviewed people where the tape didn't turn out at all. Like nothing.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh, my God. I mean, it'd be like taping this goddamn thing and then, going back and like looking at a blank screen.
Like I forgot to hit the record button. How horrible would that have been?
Yeah. Yeah, right. Right.
But you'd be cool. We'd go another 5 hours. I'm sure you're cool. You understand what it's like.
I'd be here next Sunday. I did that with Burne Hogarth. You know who Burne Hogarth is?
Yeah, of course.
Oh, sure.
Tarzan and his school and all sorts of things.
Yeah. Well, Burne was a fucking force of nature.
Yeah.
And he was widely hated in comics.
Why?
Now, well, because of that, because he was just so, he was like a conversational juggernaut. I mean, he would just run right over you. And, and most people in comics and most people of his generation, I mean, they're kind of get along kind of people. They like, easy chats and, like shop talk. And he would just expound on ideas and, and force you to answer questions. And he would demand that you explain your position on a certain matter. And most cartoonists of that generation, they didn't even know what the fuck he was talking about. He would go into art history, and he was just too much. He was just too much for most people. And so I did a long interview with Burne. And he was one of my close friends. He became one of my close friends. And I was on the phone. I was in Seattle. He was in LA. And I did like a 2.5 hour interview with him. And interviewing Burne was like wrestling an alligator. I mean, it was just, you had to be constantly on top of him. You had to, be aware of what he was saying, and you had to ask him a pertinent question. And so when you get off the phone after like 2.5 hours with Burne, you're like exhausted.
Yeah.
And so I gave the tape to our transcriber, and I'll never forget it. She, I don't know if we had email back then, but she might have called me. I think she called me. And she said, tape's blank, nothing on it.
Oh my God.
And I said, it can't be. I said, did you fast forward and did you turn it off? Yeah, I tried, both tapes.
Oh.
And so, I didn't hit the switch. There's a little switch, there's a play switch and a tape switch on this little mechanism. And I guess I just didn't hit the right goddamn switch. So I was so fucking demoralized.
Yeah, that would just kill me.
That's horrible.
And like, what do you do, So I couldn't do anything, but I had to call him and tell him. I didn't know how he was going to react, because he was a very emotional guy. But he reacted as well as you could possibly hope for. I called him up and I said, Burne, I've got like terrible news. I said, the last interview we did? He said, yeah. I said, it didn't tape. There's like no recording. And I'm really sorry. I don't know what to say. And there was a pause. And he said, well, God damn it, let's do it again.
Oh, that's awesome.
Oh, that's great.
And it was so great. And then, how if you do that, the second interview isn't as good because the guys talked out, like all the passion and everything. It was just as good.
Yeah, that's awesome.
It was like you never given
better because you were more like you were anticipating more stuff, right?
Maybe I was better, but I was worried that, he was going to go through the same stories about the School of Visual Arts and this and that,
Right.
It was as if he'd never spoken the same thing like a week earlier. I mean, he was just as passionate and just as excited about this.
Oh, that's awesome. The passion was just as good. That's the difference. Yeah.
Yeah.
On the artists that I wish would get a full treatment, Carlos Jimenez, I would like to see all of his. And
the Spanish cartoonist.
Yeah. And in terms of Spanish comics, and you won't be able to see this either, but I'm holding up Spanish Fever. You were talking about the new books that you published that deal with new material.
Yep.
This was a real treat. I enjoyed that tremendously. And
I'm so glad. That was like a sampler of Spanish cartoonists. Yeah.
Yeah, and stuff that you wouldn't see anywhere else. I mean, it's not like that's going to get a lot of publication anywhere. So that was a great book. I encourage more of that kind of thing. Well,
that's the hardest sell.
Oh,
yep.
I'm sure.
Omnibuses of that. Now, Carlos Jimenez, does his work read as well as it looks? Because I don't know.
Oh, certainly the stuff that almost looks like Schultz. That's the Peanuts characters in the orphanage, the Spanish orphanages.
Yeah.
That's really powerful stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean I read one volume of that was published a few years ago, and I was just amazed by how strong that was. I can't speak for his other stuff apart from the artistry of it. Right.
Because that's my problem, which wasn't Kim's problem, which is I can't read this stuff, so I have to either go by my gut, how it looks, how dense and interesting the storytelling is, or I have to have recommendations from people who have read it. But we have a very good track record doing it that way. But Kim could actually read them, and I can't do that.
I was going to ask you, just how crippling is it to not have him, and is it still fun even now? Is it hard?
Yeah, no, it's good. I mean, Eric Reynolds is our associate publisher, and he does a fantastic job. He's always on the lookout. He buys half of our books. He probably he's probably closer to the younger generation of cartoonists and what they're doing than I am. I mean, since I'm falling into decrepitude, I pay attention less to what young cartoonists are doing, even though I try my best. But he procures both foreign material and domestic material, and he edits Now, which you probably are aware of. So he's in touch with a lot of contemporary cartoonists. So no, I mean, it's actually it's the last 5 years has actually been a remarkably smooth running operation. And I don't really know what specifically to attribute that to. I'd like to say it's wisdom, but I'm sure that's not the case. But maybe we finally got our act together and we're publishing just the right mix of books that can sustain us commercially, and that I think are probably the best books we've ever published. I mean, I truly think that we're publishing the best work in the history of the company.
Which leads me to one other question, which is packaging, because the difference between you, and I'm not going to name other names, but out of people that are putting out a lot of product, what's your philosophy about the care that you are putting into the packaging, whether it's the women's comics or the Wizard, the Wally Wood thing, or the foreign materials? Everything is so perfectly packaged. And is that a selling point? Is that a strategy? Is it a matter of personal pride?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's a selling point. I hate to say that. It's a matter of personal pride. It's a matter that we respect these artists well enough to create packages that serve their work. In terms of design, the quality of the production, the paper, the amount of attention that we put into creating a format that is perfectly suited to the work itself. And to that, I really have to credit our design department. We have just wonderful designers. Jacob Covey leads that department. We have 3 other designers. They all care deeply about what they do. They all care deeply about comics. They know comics, and and a lot of this credit, is theirs. They will come to me. I'll assign a book, and invariably, every one of them will come back to me and say, well, this is how I see the book. It should be a little bit larger than you're anticipating, or it should be smaller, or it should be, we should do something special with the hardcover, or, they'll come up with printing designs that I would never have thought of, but that are perfectly in harmony with the work itself. I don't know. One of you talked about the earlier Eternaut.
Yeah.
Volume.
Oh,
and,
that was just.
That's in a
I have
slipcase
that. Within reach.
Yes. Just perfect. I mean, he did it perfectly.
It's fantastic.
So it's just important to us that our books are beautifully designed, and we take a lot of pride in doing that.
So my only wish would be that, whether it's in another podcast or if it's just at a con somewhere, but I would like an hour to talk movies with you.
Oh yeah, well, I'm as passionate about movies as I am about comics, maybe even more so. So.
Oh, I could talk for an hour just about the Archers and Michael Powell films. I mean, so we'd be okay. I would say
the Archers. Yeah.
Let's try to do that at some point.
I would love to. Once it would to bring it full circle, and you can cut it off at this point. But you know, I saw Steranko at a San Diego con. And, you know, at this point, I have nothing against the guy, you know. I mean, you know, he behaved kind of like a monster to me for a while, but we were talking. We were having a weirdly civilized conversation in a hotel lobby. And I said, Jim, we should do an interview, you know. And he said, oh, yeah, that'd be a great idea. Great idea. I said, all right, I'll give you a call. So, of course, I called several times, no answer. I got the message. But, you know, I would love to call and, you know, maybe just talk about movies.
Yeah.
You know?
So why do you think that is?
Why which is?
About the, like you and Jim had brought up possibly meeting and doing something. Why do you think it hasn't happened? What do you think is going on?
Well, I think our, you know, we had a kind of falling out, and I think it just sticks in his craw, and he probably doesn't want to, you know, he probably doesn't want to talk to me outside of a hotel lobby. You know? Are
you talking about the falling out in 1973 when you left? Or are you talking about another one?
Well, I'm talking about another one. It's, I mean, that wasn't too terrible. I just left. There was tension in the air, but we really didn't have a definitive falling out. I mean, I think he knew I had to go, and I knew I had to go. But then a couple of years later, you actually read from this when you were reading from snippets from the Comics Journal. It was in 1970, might have been 77. We did a little expose on Media Scene where they published a plagiarized article, and I mean it was unbelievable. It was just word for word stolen from another source.
What, by Joel Thingvall?
Yes. How in the hell did you remember that name?
My memory's kind of indexed like that.
Okay, that's good. But yes, it was like, I mean, but he was a writer who had nothing to do with comics, I don't think.
Right.
And it was from like a newspaper in Pittsburgh or Cleveland or something. So anyway, you know, Media Scene just stole it word for word and published it in Media Scene. So we found this, and you know, we were muckraking, so we had to do a piece on it. So I called up Jim and I said, Jim, you know, like, what's with this? And I sent him proof of it. And I said, there's, you know, a writer out there who's upset, you know, and Jim just defended it. I mean, it was unbelievable. I mean, instead of saying, you know, this is a big fucking mistake, we shouldn't have done this, you know, I'm going to talk to the writer who did this. This is not the way I produce a magazine. My recollection is that he just defended it, or poo-pooed it. So it doesn't make any difference. And so then we did proceed to write that expose. And Mike Catron, in his Woodward and Bernstein mode, wrote the factual article, and I wrote the analytical opinion piece about it. And I suspect it's that you know, that sticks in Jim's memory. I guess I also reviewed Chandler, now that I think about it.
Okay, and tell me about that.
That wasn't pretty. So I tend to forget, you know.
And then you reviewed Chandler.
And
did he respond to you about that or no?
No.
Okay, so this is just that you had put it out there, and maybe that's one of the things.
Yeah, and as I recall, it was a very extensive review.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
So, you know, there's these accumulated things that.
So, Alex, I can't speak for you, but I want to say it was a little bit intimidating interviewing an interviewer of the reputation and caliber that
Gary
has given us.
Well, because a lot of our format, I mean, we were influenced and inspired by a lot of your interviews, Gary, that you've done over decades. So
thanks.
It's clearly an aspect of what we're doing, and so it's definitely been a pleasure for me for all sorts of reasons, and in a weird way. I mean, although me and Jim did some interviews before, like when we started, but I will say though that I felt an odd kinship to your Fantastic Fanzine interview of Steranko because when I interviewed him, I felt like, oh wow, okay, I can, because I just met him at the bar, but we started talking about Bill Finger and random people like the Quality Comics and Eisner and the shop he had or whatever.
Yeah.
And he just liked that someone my age even knew about that. And then suddenly we were looking at original art in his room, and I go, why don't we do an interview? He's like, okay, well, let's do it. And the way we did it, and we hung out in his room for those 4 or 5 hours till like 6, 7. And after I was like, okay, I can do this. And there was something about that. And then artistically, he just said, he watched some of my YouTube videos. He's like, he liked my Houdini one a lot. And he said, I like that you're moving the panels around, but have you thought about moving the characters within the panels? And then I never thought about that. And then it started me off on all this animation stuff I did. So he had this positive thing. And when I read your Fantastic Fanzine, I was like, I kind of felt the kinship with what you guys did in that interview. So I look up to you a lot. I'm just saying.
Well, I appreciate that. It's such an embarrassing interview in retrospect. I reread it. I didn't reread the whole thing. I just kind of skimmed it. And, my questions are so dopey,
Well, you were a kid, but you had this adoration for him, which was interesting. And then obviously that changes with time. But I read that, and then I, just looking in how you your interview style and the Comics Journal, and all that, and just reading all that, and I felt a connection to a lot of it. So,
well, that's really great. Yeah, you don't know when you're doing these. when I was interviewing, all these people, and holy shit, I was interviewing a lot of people. I don't even know how I did it. I look back, and I'd interview like 8 artists a year, and they'd be 50,000 word interviews, and I would obviously have read all the books, and I was doing everything else on top of that. And I kind of marvel at my productivity. But when you're doing it, you're so in the moment that you don't know that you're doing it. That's going to be important 30 years from now or 40 years from now.
Oh, it totally is. Jim was reading that stuff in real time. I read that stuff looking back at it. Yeah. No, I'm glad. Steranko's such a blowhard, but I'm glad that I'm glad you interviewed. I'm glad you got all this on the record. Yeah.
I think that's important.
I get what you're saying about the prep and all of it. If I prepared for court the way that I prepare for these interviews, I would be something to be reckoned with.
Right.
Well,
right.
All right. Well, I'm gonna then, Jim. Any more further questions, Your Honor?
I'm gonna let it go.
All right. Well, this has been a really fun episode of the Comic Book Historians podcast with publisher, historian, virtual pornographer, Gary Groth. Thanks so much you've been so generous with your time, and Jim and I really respect your work from many levels. Thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thanks.
Thanks, Gary.